They are the pagans, and their motto is do unto others, then split.
They started as a small group of riders on the East Coast, men chasing freedom on two wheels, bonded by rebellion. But what began as a club of outsiders quickly grew into something darker. Their name was the Pagans, and within a few short years, they transformed from neighborhood riders into one of the most feared outlaw motorcycle gangs in America. Today, their colors spark fear, their history is drenched in blood, and their reputation rivals even the Hells Angels. This is not just the story of a gang, it is the rise of an empire built on violence, drugs, and domination. The birth of the Pagans. In the 1950s and 1960s, America's highways were exploding with freedom. Cars roared down newly built interstates, rock and roll was on the radio, and young men restless from war or weary of suburbia sought escape on motorcycles. These weren't just bikes, they were symbols of rebellion. On the East Coast, where factory jobs chained men to routine and the grit of industrial cities weighed heavy, motorcycles became a ticket out. And from this need to escape, to carve out an identity that society rejected, came a group of riders who would eventually call themselves the Pagans Motorcycle Club. The origins of the Pagans weren't grand. There was no master plan, no blueprint to become one of the most feared outlaw motorcycle clubs in America. It started small, working-class men in Maryland and surrounding areas gathering on weekends, riding together, drinking together, and escaping the dull repetition of everyday life. In the beginning, the Pagans looked more like a neighborhood motorcycle association than a gang. They had patches, but not the fearsome imagery yet. They had rules, but not the ironclad outlaw code that would later define them. But something was already brewing beneath the surface. Unlike other motorcycle clubs that were content with riding and camaraderie, the Pagans attracted a different kind of man. Harder, meaner, restless. They weren't satisfied with being another social club on two wheels. They wanted to be respected, feared, and recognized as the toughest riders on the East Coast. This hunger for dominance would prove to be the seed of everything that followed. The Pagans grew during a time when outlaw biker culture was exploding across America. On the West Coast, the Hells Angels were already grabbing headlines for their wild parties, violent clashes, and growing criminal connections. In the Midwest, the outlaws were doing the same. For the East Coast, the Pagans would become that symbol of chaos and rebellion. The name itself carried menace. Taken from ancient non-believers who rejected organized religion, the Pagans symbolized rejection of law, order, and society itself. By the late 1960s, the club had its first president, Lou Dobkin. Dobkin wasn't a movie-style biker with wild charisma. He was cold, calculating, and determined to turn the club into something much larger. He recognized that the Pagans weren't just a group of riders. They could be an army. Under his leadership, the club began to expand chapter by chapter along the eastern seaboard. What had begun as a small Maryland outfit was suddenly spreading like wildfire into Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and beyond. The way they grew was simple: intimidation and recruitment. Ride into a town, make themselves known, and either local riders patched over, or they were crushed. It was a strategy that worked because the Pagans weren't afraid of confrontation. If someone resisted, fists flew, knives came out, and sometimes worse. Word spread quickly. When the Pagans came, you either joined them or you kept your head down. The early Pagans became infamous for their look as much as their actions. They weren't polished or polished rebels like Hollywood bikers. They were rough, dirty, and intimidating. Their patch, a menacing depiction of the Norse fire god Surtur, became a warning sign to anyone who saw it. While most motorcycle clubs still carried a hint of camaraderie and fun, the Pagans projected menace. Even in their earliest days, walking into a bar with pagan jackets on meant something. Trouble was near. But it wasn't just about intimidation. The Pagans began to build a culture around themselves. Loyalty was absolute. Betrayal was unthinkable. Violence wasn't just expected, it was celebrated. Every beating handed out to rivals, every bar brawl, every intimidation tactic reinforced their reputation. They weren't the biggest motorcycle club in America, but in their region, they were quickly becoming the most feared. By the early 1970s, the Pagans had already separated themselves from the average motorcycle crowd. They didn't want to be weekend warriors, they wanted power. They wanted to dominate territory, control money, and strike fear into anyone who dared oppose them. Small-time hustling became organized racketeering. Drug deals that started out casual became pipelines. And through it all, the club grew tighter, more structured, and more ruthless. The East Coast wasn't ready for them. In a region filled with powerful mobs, dangerous street gangs, and entrenched crime families, the pagans stood out for one reason. They didn't back down. They didn't care if their rivals were armed. They didn't care if the police were watching. They didn't care if civilians got caught in the middle. Every fight was taken to the extreme, and every confrontation became a chance to prove that the pagans were not just another motorcycle club. They were a force of nature. In the beginning, the pagans were underestimated. Other clubs saw them as upstarts, rough riders who weren't in the same league as the angels, outlaws, or bandidos. But what everyone soon learned was that the pagans weren't trying to imitate anyone. They were carving out their own legacy of terror. From backroad rides to brutal street wars, their rise was just beginning. What made the pagans' birth so dangerous was that it wasn't about fun or freedom anymore. It was about survival and power. Every new member meant another soldier. Every new chapter meant more territory, and every act of violence meant another message sent to the underworld. The pagans were here, and they weren't leaving. Early violence. The pagans were born in rebellion, but it was their early violence that carved their identity in blood. While other motorcycle clubs of the era might have fought among themselves in parking lots or bars, the pagans turned brutality into a calling card. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, anyone in Maryland, Pennsylvania, or New Jersey who saw a jacket bearing the fire god Surtur knew that trouble was close behind. In their early years, fights were spontaneous, but never small. A night of drinking could quickly turn into a scene of chaos when the pagans decided someone looked at them the wrong way or disrespected their colors. They swung fists until bones snapped, then followed up with boots, knives, or chains. What separated them from other clubs wasn't just their willingness to fight. It was how far they were willing to go. Bar fights didn't end when one side gave up. They ended when someone was unconscious, bleeding, or worse. This earned the pagans a reputation with police departments up and down the East Coast. Officers learned quickly that responding to a call involving the pagans meant walking into carnage. Broken glass, overturned tables, and victims left behind to crawl to the hospital. Arrests became routine, but convictions were rare. Witnesses feared retaliation, and victims often chose to keep their mouths shut rather than risk another beating. Violence became so central to pagan culture that it wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. New members weren't fully trusted until they proved themselves in a fight. Earning a patch wasn't just about riding or brotherhood, it was about showing that you could swing hard, take a beating, and come back for more. Prospects were thrown into fights deliberately, tested to see if they would hold the line when the fists and blades came out. Those who failed quietly disappeared. Those who succeeded carried the scars as proof they belonged. But these weren't just random fights. The pagans began using violence strategically. They shook down bar owners, strip clubs, and small businesses, forcing them to pay for protection. Those who refused quickly learned what protection really meant. A broken jaw, a smashed-up storefront, tires slashed and windows shattered until compliance came naturally. The pagans didn't need lawyers or contracts. Their power came from fear, and fear was enforced with blood. The early 1970s brought the first real confrontations with rival motorcycle clubs. On the East Coast, smaller independent clubs tried to hold their ground. It rarely worked. If another patch showed up in a bar the pagans considered theirs, a fight was guaranteed. By the end of the night, that rival either joined the pagans, fled the city, or was carried out on a stretcher. One story still whispered among old investigators involved a pagan walking into a bar where a rival biker was drinking alone. Instead of words, the pagan smashed a beer bottle across his face, dragged him outside, and beat him until his own brothers pulled him away. The rival survived but never returned to that town. For the pagans, this wasn't excessive. It was policy. Their colors had to mean fear, and every act of violence reinforced it. The brutality didn't stop with outsiders. The pagans also kept their own members in line with fists and steel. Anyone who broke the code, whether by skimming money, showing disrespect, or acting weak, was punished in ways that left permanent reminders. Members were beaten by their own brothers, while the rest watched, learning what disobedience cost. In some cases, the punishment went further. A brother who betrayed the club might vanish altogether, his fate left to rumor and silence. What made the pagans' violence so effective was how unpredictable it was. They weren't bound by restraint or rules of engagement. If someone crossed them, the response could be immediate and overwhelming. A simple insult could end with hospital beds. A rival making the wrong move could find his bike in flames the next morning. Their enemies never knew when or how the pagans would strike, only that they would. This atmosphere of constant aggression made law enforcement nervous. Police departments began labeling the pagans as a rising outlaw threat, warning that their appetite for violence rivaled anything seen on the East Coast before. Reports circulated that the club's numbers were growing, their fights were getting bloodier, and their disregard for authority made them nearly impossible to control. The violence also brought unwanted attention from the public. Newspaper headlines began to describe biker riots and gang wars, with the pagans often at the center. Ordinary citizens grew terrified of sharing space with them. A family out for dinner might leave a restaurant if a dozen pagans walked in. Women clutched their purses tighter on sidewalks, and bartenders braced for chaos as soon as the patches appeared. Fear spread faster than the actual bloodshed, but that was exactly how the pagans wanted it. The more violent they became, the more powerful their reputation grew. They weren't the biggest club yet, but they didn't have to be. Their fists and knives spoke louder than numbers ever could. By the time the 1970s reached their peak, the pagans had already carved a name for themselves as a gang you didn't challenge. Their rise had begun not with diplomacy or alliances, but with the raw, brutal language of violence. Expansion on the East Coast. The pagans had proven themselves through violence. By the early 1970s, their name carried weight in bars, neighborhoods, and criminal circles from Maryland to Pennsylvania. But the true rise of the pagans wasn't just about throwing fists in local taverns. It was about expansion. A gang that stayed small would eventually be swallowed by larger forces. The Hells Angels were pushing eastward, the Outlaws had roots in the Midwest, and smaller clubs dotted the map. If the pagans wanted survival, they needed to grow. And they chose to grow the only way they knew how: through force, intimidation, and calculated takeover. At first, expansion meant moving into nearby cities. Maryland was their home, but soon Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Atlantic City became pagan strongholds. Each move followed the same pattern. A handful of members would roll into town, stake a claim, and make their presence impossible to ignore. If a rival club existed, the pagans confronted them directly. Sometimes the rivals patched over, abandoning their old colors for the pagan patch. Sometimes they fought, and when they did, the pagans fought dirtier, harder, and longer. By the end, the outcome was the same. The fire god Surtur spread his shadow over new ground. But the pagans weren't just after territory for the sake of pride. Expansion brought money. Each new city meant more bars to tax, more clubs to control, and more businesses to squeeze. Every new chapter meant another network for moving drugs, weapons, and stolen goods. The pagans quickly realized that dominance on the East Coast could mean riches beyond anything they'd imagined when they were just a group of riders drinking beers in Maryland. What made the expansion terrifying was the discipline behind it. These weren't random riders starting chapters wherever they wanted. Expansion was strategic. Pagan leaders chose locations with care. They wanted access to ports, highways, and urban centers where money and crime flowed. Atlantic City wasn't chosen for its boardwalk, it was chosen because gambling, nightlife, and vice meant endless opportunity. Philadelphia wasn't about cheesesteaks, it was about docks, unions, and access to organized crime families who could move drugs by the ton. With expansion came structure. The pagans began to organize themselves less like a brotherhood of riders and more like a corporation of criminals. Chapters answered to regional leaders. Orders came down from the top. Disputes were settled by violence, but also by internal codes that reinforced hierarchy. For the first time, the pagans weren't just feared brawlers. They were a machine. This new discipline made them even more dangerous. Rival clubs could fight them, but they couldn't match their organization. Street gangs could challenge them, but they didn't have the network. Even police struggled because the pagans weren't just causing random chaos anymore. They were building an empire, and every act of violence had purpose behind it. The expansion wasn't without bloodshed. In many places, smaller independent clubs tried to hold their ground. They learned quickly what resistance meant. Some chapters were absorbed by the pagans after bloody confrontations. Others were wiped out completely, their members driven into hiding or left beaten in the streets. To outsiders, it looked like chaos, but inside the pagan ranks, it was calculated conquest. By the mid-1970s, the pagans had chapters in multiple states, stretching across the eastern seaboard. Their numbers grew into the hundreds, and with each new member came new muscle. It wasn't just the number of bikers that terrified their rivals, it was the quality of their soldiers. Every pagan had been tested, every pagan had proven loyalty through violence, and every pagan knew that failure to act meant punishment worse than death. Expansion also brought them into closer contact with organized crime. In Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Atlantic City, the pagans rubbed shoulders with the Italian mafia, Irish street gangs, and various underworld figures. Deals were struck, alliances formed. At times, the pagans worked for mob bosses, providing muscle or handling dirty jobs. At other times, they forced the mob to recognize them as equals. demanding their share of the profits flowing through the city. Either way, their reach only grew stronger. Law enforcement watched this expansion with alarm. Reports described the pagans as spreading like wildfire, consuming territories one by one. Local police forces were often overwhelmed, rolling into town and making themselves at home. Even when arrests were made, intimidation kept juries silent and witnesses away. The pagans weren't just fighting rivals, they were undermining the very systems meant to stop them. Perhaps the most unsettling part of the pagan expansion was the culture they carried with them. Each new chapter brought the same code: absolute loyalty, absolute violence, and absolute fear. From Baltimore to Atlantic City, from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, stories circulated of pagan brutality. Men beaten with chains, bars burned down, entire neighborhoods forced to live under their shadow. The consistency of this fear showed just how deeply the pagans had embedded their identity in the East Coast underworld. By the late 1970s, it was undeniable. The pagans were no longer a regional nuisance. They were a power. Their expansion had made them one of the most dominant outlaw motorcycle clubs on the East Coast, rivaling the outlaws in the Midwest and preparing them for inevitable clashes with the Hells Angels. Their rise wasn't just about numbers. It was about a reputation for violence that grew with every new chapter, a reputation that turned their expansion into legend. First blood with the Hells Angels. For years, the pagans spread across the East Coast with fists, blades, and fire, but as much as they terrified local gangs and dominated small towns, one name loomed larger than them all: the Hells Angels. By the 1970s, the Angels had already become a global force. Their red and white patches were feared on the West Coast, in Europe, and even in movies and newspapers. If the pagans wanted to rule the East Coast, they knew a collision with the Hells Angels wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. The rivalry didn't begin with a declaration of war. It began with chance encounters, patches crossing in bars, and tension that could be cut with a knife. When an angel and a pagan walked into the same room, everyone else knew to clear out. Fists would fly, bottles would smash, and the aftermath was often a bloodied floor and silent witnesses. The first encounters were small skirmishes, but they lit the fuse for a conflict that would spiral into one of the most violent biker rivalries in American history. The pagans saw the Angels as arrogant invaders, bikers from the West who believed their reputation alone made them kings. The Angels saw the pagans as dirty, unpolished upstarts, wild dogs playing at being wolves. Both sides had egos too large, tempers too short, and too much pride to back down. The result was blood. One of the earliest flashpoints came in New Jersey. The pagans had long considered the state their home turf, a critical bridge between Philadelphia, Atlantic City, and New York. When the Angels tried to plant a foothold there, the pagans responded with unrelenting violence. Bars that dared to serve Angels found themselves vandalized. Angel bikes were set on fire in parking lots. Members were ambushed, beaten, and in some cases left for dead. For the pagans, New Jersey wasn't negotiable. It was their territory, and no one, not even the Hells Angels, would take it. The Angels, of course, didn't back down. Retaliations came quick and vicious. Pagan hangouts were firebombed. Members caught alone were beaten with chains and bats. Even public spaces weren't safe. One brawl in the late 1970s at a Newark bar turned into a full-on riot with knives flashing, fists pounding, and bodies collapsing. Police swarmed the scene, but by the time they restored order, dozens were injured and both sides had sent a message. This wasn't a rivalry anymore, it was war. The escalation only continued through the 1980s. Pagan leaders began to see the Angels not just as rivals, but as existential threats. If the Angels secured New Jersey or New York, they could strangle the Pagans' expansion and control the entire East Coast. To stop this, the Pagans unleashed their most violent enforcers, men whose only job was to hurt and kill in the name of the patch. Pagan squads began hunting Angels with military-like precision, tracking their movements, targeting their businesses, and waiting for moments when they were most vulnerable. The violence became so intense that law enforcement agencies from multiple states began issuing joint reports warning of a full-scale biker war. FBI files described both clubs as paramilitary organizations operating with extreme violence and zero regard for civilian life. Investigators feared that the battles could spill into city streets, threatening not just bikers, but anyone unlucky enough to be nearby. And they were right. Innocent bystanders were injured, some killed, as bombs exploded and bullets flew in densely populated neighborhoods. What made the rivalry particularly terrifying was how public it became. The Angels, used to media coverage, often flaunted their battles. The Pagans, however, embraced something darker: quiet, surgical brutality. While the angels made headlines, the pagans made bodies disappear. One former investigator later remarked that what set the pagans apart was their unpredictability. With the angels, you expected chaos. With the pagans, you didn't know if it was coming at all, until you were already bleeding. By the late 1980s, both sides had dug in. The angels had stronger numbers worldwide, but the pagans had home advantage on the East Coast and a willingness to outmatch violence with savagery. Their clashes weren't just brawls anymore, they were wars for survival. Every bar fight, every ambush, every bombing was part of a larger chess game played in blood. Inside the pagan code, the pagans grew through violence and carved their place on the East Coast with fire and steel. But what kept the gang together through all that blood wasn't just fear from outsiders. It was a code, a set of unspoken and spoken rules that made the pagans more than just a gang of bikers. It turned them into a brotherhood, bound by loyalty, discipline, and the constant threat of punishment. At the heart of the pagan code was absolute loyalty. Once you wore the patch, you weren't just part of a club, you were property of it. Every action, every decision, every move you made reflected on the pagans as a whole. Betrayal wasn't tolerated, hesitation wasn't excused, and weakness was considered as dangerous as treason. Members were expected to put the club above family, above friends, and above everything else in their lives. A wife or child might plead for a man to leave, but the patch came first, and anyone who questioned that soon learned why no one left the pagans without consequences. Violence wasn't only a weapon against outsiders, it was a tool for discipline inside the club. If a member disrespected leadership, disobeyed an order, or even embarrassed the club in public, he would be punished. Punishment often came in the form of beatings carried out by his own brothers. These weren't symbolic slaps on the wrist, they were brutal assaults that left bones broken and skin torn. Sometimes they were public, carried out in front of other members as a warning. Other times they were private, meant to send a message that the club always had eyes and the code was always enforced. Another pillar of the pagan code was silence. No one talked to the police. Ever. To even be suspected of talking could mean a death sentence. The pagans prided themselves on being airtight, harder to infiltrate than most gangs, and much of that came from this culture of fear. Members knew that the slightest whisper to law enforcement would be met with retribution, not just for themselves, but sometimes for their families too. It was this vow of silence that allowed the pagans to grow into a criminal empire without constant collapse from informants. The code also dictated how members lived their daily lives. There were strict rules about who could wear the pagan patch and how. Members were forbidden from letting anyone touch their colors, even wives or girlfriends. To disrespect the patch was to disrespect the entire brotherhood. The same applied to territory. Pagans defended their bars, their neighborhoods, and their chapters with religious devotion. Even the smallest slight, like a rival biker hanging out in a pagan bar, was treated as a violation of sacred law. The chain of command was another unshakable part of the code. Every chapter had a president, vice president, and enforcers. Orders moved down, not up. The man at the top gave direction, and those below carried it out without question. Disobedience wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. A pagan who ignored orders risked not just punishment, but elimination. In a world where weakness could get the whole gang killed, the code demanded obedience without hesitation. But perhaps the most frightening part of the pagan code was how it glorified violence as honor. Members weren't only expected to fight, they were expected to enjoy it. Bloodshed became proof of loyalty. A man who could throw punches, stab rivals, or pull a trigger without blinking wasn't just a good pagan, he was a great one. Stories of members' violence became legends, retold at gatherings to inspire fear and admiration. In this way, the code fed itself, each act of brutality cementing the culture that made the pagans so feared. The rituals reinforced the code further. Prospects, the men trying to earn a patch, were subjected to humiliation, dangerous tasks, and brutal tests to prove their worth. They might be ordered to fight multiple men at once or commit crimes that could send them to prison, all just to prove their loyalty. Once they passed, the initiation into full membership was both a reward and a curse. They were celebrated for joining the brotherhood, but they also crossed a line they could never return from. Even money was tied to the code. Members were expected to contribute to the club, whether through dues, cuts from criminal earnings, or simply providing for brothers in need. To refuse was to break the code. And when debts weren't paid, the enforcers stepped in, ensuring no one forgot that the pagans owned every part of their lives. Law enforcement often described the pagan code as a mixture of military structure and cult-like devotion. It made the club nearly impossible to infiltrate because members truly believed in the sanctity of their brotherhood. and those who doubted, they were removed in the most permanent ways possible. Deals with the mob. By the time the pagans had carved their name in blood across the East Coast, one truth had become clear: violence could win them territory, but it couldn't win them empires. To control entire cities, to move drugs by the ton, to launder money without collapsing under police pressure, they needed partners who already had those systems in place. And on the East Coast, no one had deeper roots in crime than the mob. The Italian mafia had been running rackets for decades, their influence stretching from the docks of New York to the gambling dens of Atlantic City. They controlled unions, ports, politicians, and pipelines of drugs flowing in from overseas. For the pagans, forging ties with these families wasn't just a smart move, it was survival. They needed the mob's connections, and the mob needed the pagans' muscle. The alliance started small. Pagans worked as hired enforcers for mob bosses who wanted debts collected or rivals silenced. If a loan shark needed someone roughed up, pagans handled it. If a witness needed to be scared out of testifying, pagans did the job. The mob liked them because they were reliable. The pagans didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions, and didn't leave loose ends. What started as contract work soon grew into something bigger. Drugs were the bridge that cemented the relationship. The mob had the international pipelines, shipments of heroin, cocaine, and meth flowing in through East Coast ports. The pagans had the street soldiers. Together they built a distribution network that funneled drugs from shipping containers into neighborhoods across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and beyond. Every sale put money into both pockets. Every deal deepened the bond between bikers and mobsters. But alliances with the mob were never safe. They came with rules, with expectations, and with punishments for failure. Pagan leaders quickly learned that mob bosses weren't to be crossed. Missed payments or sloppy mistakes could mean more than just a warning. Entire chapters risked being cut off, or worse. Yet the pagans thrived under this pressure. Their violent culture made them perfectly suited to the mob's demands. If someone stepped out of line, the pagans didn't just fix the problem, they eliminated it. This partnership also gave the pagans legitimacy in the criminal underworld. Small-time gangs suddenly had to treat them with respect, not just because of their fists, but because of who stood behind them. A pagan wasn't just a biker anymore, he was a soldier tied to powerful mafia families. Bars and clubs that resisted paying protection to the pagans quickly found themselves pressured by mob associates too. It was a 1-2 punch few dared to challenge. Of course, the relationship wasn't without friction. The mob valued discipline, order, and predictability. The pagans thrived on chaos, fear, and blood. There were times when the bikers' unpredictability caused headaches for mob bosses, especially when public violence drew police attention, but the money was too good, and the pagans too useful for the alliance to break. Whenever tensions rose, leaders on both sides smoothed things over, often with more cash and more promises of loyalty. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the pagans were heavily intertwined with organized crime. They weren't just muscle anymore, they were partners in rackets that stretched across entire states, from meth labs in rural Pennsylvania to heroin shipments hitting New York. Pagan fingerprints were everywhere. Their members were seen in mob-controlled casinos, strip clubs, and trucking companies, blurring the line between biker gang and mafia family. Law enforcement struggled to untangle the web. Investigators who tracked the pagans often found themselves running into mob operations, and vice versa. One FBI agent later remarked that trying to hit the pagans without hitting the mob was like trying to pull one snake out of a pit without touching the others. The two groups had become so intertwined that targeting one meant provoking both. The deals with the mob also escalated the pagans' internal culture. With more money flowing in, the stakes grew higher. Disputes over drug profits or territory weren't just internal matters anymore. They were tied to mafia contracts. A pagan who stole from the club wasn't just betraying his brothers, he was endangering the entire network. That kind of betrayal wasn't forgiven. It was punished with brutality so severe it made headlines, reinforcing the pagans' image as one of the most dangerous outlaw biker gangs in America. Drugs and dominance. For all the violence, all the backroom deals, and all the alliances with the mob, nothing fueled the rise of the pagans quite like drugs. It was narcotics that turned the club from a feared biker gang into a criminal empire, and it was the drug trade that made them millionaires while burying countless bodies along the way. The early days were small time, bags of marijuana here, a few pills there, the kind of street-level hustle that paid for beer and bikes but didn't build empires. That changed when the pagans discovered methamphetamine, cheap to make, easy to move, and wildly addictive. Meth became their golden ticket. Unlike heroin or cocaine, which required international pipelines and connections, meth could be cooked right at home in rural basements, backwoods barns, and makeshift labs. And once it hit the streets, demand never stopped. The pagans didn't just sell meth, they industrialized it. Entire chapters were tasked with running cook sites, securing chemicals, and protecting distribution networks. These weren't small batches. They were large-scale operations producing pounds at a time, enough to flood entire cities. From Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, from Baltimore to Atlantic City, meth with pagan fingerprints on it was everywhere. But meth was only the beginning. As their network expanded, the pagans became middlemen for heroin and cocaine too, thanks to their alliances with organized crime. They didn't always handle the international shipments, but once the drugs hit the ports, the pagans became the enforcers and distributors. Street gangs bought from them, dealers paid them. Every transaction put money into pagan pockets, and every dollar reinforced their dominance. The profits transformed the club. What had once been a ragtag group of riders was now flush with cash. Members drove luxury cars, carried stacks of bills, and flaunted jewelry alongside their biker cuts. Clubhouses became fortresses of crime, filled with drugs, weapons, and cash. Bars and strip clubs run by pagans turned into hubs for distribution, where deals were cut under neon lights and backed by muscle waiting in the shadows, but the drug money came with blood. Anyone who crossed the pagans in business quickly learned what happened to traitors. Dealers who failed to pay were beaten, maimed, or killed. Rival gangs who tried to cut into their profits were hunted down. Even family members weren't safe if they got in the way. Stories spread of pagans torching houses, ambushing rivals, and leaving bodies in alleys as warnings. The drug trade didn't just make them rich, it made them feared in ways no bar fight ever could. Law enforcement soon recognized the scale of the problem. Local police couldn't keep up with the sheer size of pagan distribution. State and federal agencies began targeting them, launching joint operations that stretched for years. Undercover agents infiltrated drug pipelines, wiretaps tracked shipments, and indictments piled up. But for every raid, every bust, another pagan lab popped up somewhere else. The demand was too high, the profits too rich, and the brotherhood too loyal to stop. Inside the club, drugs became more than business, they became culture. Many pagans used the same drugs they sold, particularly meth and cocaine, feeding addictions that drove their violence even higher. Fights became more savage, paranoia spread, and the gang's unpredictability reached terrifying levels. A pagan high on meth wasn't just dangerous, he was uncontrollable, capable of violence even his own brothers feared. The dominance wasn't just about drugs on the street, it was about control. In some towns, the pagans didn't just sell drugs, they controlled entire markets. Local dealers had no choice but to buy from them. Independent cooks or smugglers were forced out or eliminated. Entire neighborhoods came under pagan shadow, where every dollar spent on drugs found its way back to the fire god patch. And through it all, the pagan leadership reaped the rewards. Millions in cash flowed upward, enriching presidents, vice presidents, and national officers who lived lives far beyond what most outlaws could dream of. With wealth came influence, with influence came more soldiers, and with more soldiers came deeper control of the East Coast drug trade. The pagans had always thrived on violence, but with drugs, they learned something even more dangerous: how to turn that violence into an empire. The fists, knives, and guns that once built their reputation now protected a business worth millions. And as long as the demand for meth, heroin, and cocaine never slowed, the pagans knew their dominance would only grow. Law enforcement in the crosshairs. For most outlaw motorcycle clubs, clashes with the police are inevitable, but for the pagans, it went far beyond arrests and raids. They didn't just resist law enforcement, they declared war on it. From the late 1970s onward, as the pagans grew into a drug-fueled empire, police became more than a nuisance. They were obstacles, threats to profit, and, most dangerously, targets. Members of the club didn't simply fear cops, they plotted against them, and in some cases, they made examples out of them. Stories from the East Coast tell of patrol cars ambushed, officers stalked after hours, and investigators warned with firebombs hurled through their windows. In New Jersey, a detective working a pagan case came out one morning to find his personal car torched, the hood spray-painted with the fire god symbol. In Baltimore, a local cop was beaten so severely outside a pagan-run bar that he was left unconscious in the street, with a note pinned to his uniform, "Stay out of our business." The tactics were meant to instill fear, and often they worked. Local police forces, underfunded and outnumbered, found themselves reluctant to patrol neighborhoods dominated by the pagans. Routine stops became high-risk encounters, and any officer who dared to investigate too aggressively risked becoming a target. But it wasn't just small-town cops. Federal investigators, prosecutors, even judges felt the pressure. Cases against pagans were complicated by witness intimidation, mysterious disappearances of evidence, and juries too scared to convict. On one occasion, a prosecutor received a package on his desk containing a dead rat and a single bullet. The message was unmistakable: convict the pagan on trial, and you're next. At the street level, the violence escalated. Raids on pagan clubhouses were met with open hostility. Bottles thrown, shots fired, dogs set loose. Cops raiding meth labs often found themselves walking into traps, booby-trapped doors, hidden explosives, or guard posts manned by armed brothers ready to shoot. It wasn't just organized crime, it was insurgency. Perhaps most chilling were the reports of cops being followed home. Wives noticed motorcycles trailing them on their drive, children spotted unfamiliar men outside their schools. It created an atmosphere where law enforcement officers had to look over their shoulders every day, knowing the pagans were watching. For a gang that thrived on fear, this was as much a weapon as any knife or gun. Law enforcement responded with force of its own. By the 1990s, federal task forces were assembled, combining the FBI, ATF, and DEA to dismantle the pagan network. But even these elite squads struggled. Every time they made an arrest, another pagan seemed to step up. Informants planted inside the club disappeared, some never to be seen again. Those who survived lived the rest of their lives under protection, haunted by the threat of revenge. One veteran ATF agent described the pagans as a shadow army. Unlike traditional organized crime families that operated behind closed doors, the pagans were loud, aggressive, and willing to put their violence on full display. They wanted cops to know they weren't afraid, that they would meet force with force. In their world, the badge didn't carry authority, it painted a target. Courtrooms became battlefields too. Pagan members on trial often filled the gallery with brothers in full colors, their presence a silent warning to jurors and witnesses alike. Judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys alike spoke of the intimidation that hung over the room like smoke. And when convictions were secured, prisons didn't guarantee safety. Many correctional officers were assaulted or threatened by pagan inmates who carried the war behind bars. What made the conflict even more dangerous was the corruption that crept in. In some towns, officers looked the other way. Payoffs ensured that bars and clubhouses stayed open, raids were tipped off, and investigations were quietly buried. For every honest cop trying to take the pagans down, another had been bought off or scared silent. This dual reality made the gang feel untouchable. The pagans weren't content to simply evade the law. They wanted to dominate it, to make the system itself bend under their presence. Every firebombed cruiser, every intimidated jury, every silenced witness was a message. The pagans answer to no one. And yet, even in the face of relentless investigations and high-profile trials, their aggression against law enforcement never fully stopped. For them, it wasn't just about profit. It was about identity. To be a pagan was to be an outlaw in the truest sense, someone who didn't just live outside the law, but stood against it, knife in hand, daring anyone to cross their line. The modern pagans. The story of the pagans isn't frozen in the past. They didn't fade like so many outlaw clubs that burned bright and then collapsed under their own violence. No, the pagans are still here, bigger, bolder, and more dangerous than ever. Today, the club claims thousands of members spread across multiple states, with strongholds in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and New York. Their colors still carry the same fear they did decades ago, and their reputation as one of the Big Four outlaw motorcycle gangs remains firmly intact. But unlike the romanticized biker image you see in movies, the modern pagans are less about open-road brotherhood and more about organized systemic crime. At the center of their current power is Keith Conan Richter, the national president whose name alone makes law enforcement uneasy. Richter isn't just a symbol of loyalty, he's proof that the pagans still live and breathe violence. Under his watch, the gang has grown aggressively, expanding into new states while reinforcing control over old ones. Law enforcement reports describe them as disciplined, ruthless, and increasingly militarized. No longer a scattered gang of bikers, but a coordinated army of criminals. The money still comes from the same sources: drugs, extortion, and violence. Methamphetamine remains their crown jewel, but cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl have also entered their pipelines. The modern pagans control street-level distribution networks that stretch from rural towns to urban centers. Local dealers either buy from them or disappear. Rival gangs risk bloodshed if they try to move in. And with their long-standing ties to organized crime, the pagans have the logistics to move product at a scale most gangs can only dream of. But the modern pagans don't just stop at drugs. They've embedded themselves in extortion rackets, strip clubs, and loan sharking operations. Their reputation alone often secures their profits. Business owners know what happens when they say no, and many pay without protest. Others who resist often wake up to vandalized shops, firebombed cars, or beatings in the middle of the street. Fear is as much a currency as money itself. What makes the modern pagans especially dangerous is their willingness to target law enforcement and rivals alike in full view of the public. In 2019, a massive brawl broke out at a New Jersey bar, leaving multiple people hospitalized and sending shockwaves through the biker world. Witnesses described a scene of chaos: chairs flying, knives flashing, and bikers in full pagan colors unleashing violence like it was routine. For the pagans, it wasn't just a fight, it was a statement. We are still the kings of the East Coast. Federal prosecutors have also highlighted the gang's use of military-style weapons and tactics. During raids, police have seized explosives, assault rifles, and stockpiles of ammunition. Some pagans wear bulletproof vests, carry radios, and coordinate like soldiers on a battlefield. This isn't just street violence anymore, it's organized warfare. And it's aimed at anyone who dares to challenge them. The FBI, ATF, and DEA continue to launch investigations, but dismantling the pagans has proven nearly impossible. Their strict code of silence remains intact. Members rarely talk, and those who even appear to waver risk swift punishment. Informants are almost always exposed, and the consequences are deadly. Trials drag on for years, but convictions never seem to slow the machine. For every member put behind bars, another steps up, ready to bleed for the patch. The modern pagans also remain deeply feared inside prison walls. Their reputation ensures protection and influence behind bars, where they recruit, intimidate, and maintain ties to the outside world. Even incarcerated, their leaders pull strings, sending orders that ripple across states. The club doesn't stop at the prison gate, it thrives within it. For communities along the East Coast, the pagans are more than just a shadow, they're a presence. Their bikes roar through towns, their patches appear in bars, and their violence leaves marks that never fully fade. Parents warn their kids, businesses pay their dues, and rivals think twice before crossing them. And yet, despite decades of indictments, raids, and headlines, the pagans endure. They've survived betrayals, massacres, and endless battles with both rivals and law enforcement. Their rise wasn't just about violence, it was about adaptability. When one leader fell, another rose. When one racket collapsed, another opened. They've shifted, evolved, and endured, always finding new ways to thrive in the shadows. Because if the past has shown us anything, it's this: when the pagans rise, they don't stop. And for the enemies who stand in their way, the cost is always the same: blood on the pavement and silence in their wake. Betrayals from within. For decades, the pagans' greatest strength has been their code, loyalty above all else. But like any criminal empire, their greatest threat has often come not from outside enemies, but from within. The pagans built themselves into a fortress of silence, teaching every member that the club came before family, freedom, and even life itself. Yet time and again, cracks have appeared in that wall. And when they did, the fallout was devastating. The first cracks came in the form of small betrayals. Members skimming cash from drug deals, hiding profits from leadership, or cutting secret side deals with rival gangs. These weren't minor offenses. To the pagans, theft wasn't about money, it was about honor. A man who stole from his brothers wasn't just a thief, he was a traitor. And traitors didn't walk away. Stories spread of pagans who vanished overnight, only to be found days later, beaten beyond recognition or dumped in shallow graves. But the real betrayals were far worse. Law enforcement agencies, desperate to take down the gang, sought to turn members into informants. For years it seemed impossible. The code of silence was too strong, the fear of retribution too heavy. Yet eventually, men cracked. Facing life sentences, some decided prison wasn't worth their loyalty. They talked, they named names. And when they did, the entire club shook. The most damaging betrayals came in the 2000s, when undercover operations exposed members at the highest levels. FBI stings revealed not only drug trafficking and weapons charges, but also connections between national officers and organized crime families. Indictments swept up dozens of members at once, and much of it was fueled by men who once swore the pagan oath. The fallout was catastrophic. Raids on clubhouses, seizures of drugs and cash, and public trials that dragged the pagan name into the spotlight. Inside the club, the paranoia grew. Brothers began to wonder who they could trust. Meetings became tense, members accused one another, and punishments grew harsher. In some chapters, mere suspicion was enough to get a man beaten or expelled. Leaders knew that the greatest danger to the pagans wasn't always a rival biker or a federal agent. It was the man sitting beside them at the clubhouse table. One betrayal in particular sent shockwaves through the gang. A respected member, facing decades in prison, agreed to testify in exchange for a lighter sentence. His testimony directly implicated leaders in multiple murders, drug shipments, and racketeering schemes. For the pagans, it was a nightmare, proof that their code could be broken, that loyalty had limits. The club moved quickly to erase his name from their ranks, but the damage was done. Entire networks collapsed, and dozens of brothers went to prison because one man chose survival over silence. These betrayals left scars deeper than any war with the Hells Angels or the Outlaws. Rivals could be fought, cops could be killed, but betrayal from within poisoned the very heart of the brotherhood. The pagans responded with even more brutality, enforcing loyalty with fear. Members suspected of weakness were tested, pushed to commit acts of violence that tied them to the club forever. Once blood was on your hands, leaving was no longer an option. Yet the betrayals never stopped completely. As long as prison sentences loomed and federal agents dangled deals, some pagans chose to flip. And each time they did, the gang had to tighten its ranks, rebuild, and remind the world why betraying the pagans was one of the deadliest decisions a man could ever make. The modern pagans live with this constant tension. They are stronger than ever, feared across the East Coast, but they know their empire can't be destroyed from the outside. If they ever fall, it will come from within, brothers turning on brothers, and loyalty breaking under the weight of fear. That is the dark irony of the pagans' rise. The same violence that keeps them powerful is the same violence that drives men to betray them. And in the outlaw world, betrayal is never forgiven. It's only repaid in blood.
To throw the bigger and better parties. They started being like one party would have some strippers at it, so then the next chapter would want to make sure they had more at theirs, or people were drinking or going harder. And one of our bigger parties every year is Palm Springs.
The Mongols Motorcycle Club is one of the most violent outlaw brotherhoods on earth. Founded in 1969 in East Los Angeles by war veterans and street riders, they built their name through fear, not fame. Every territory they entered turned into a battlefield: casinos, highways, neighborhoods soaked in gunfire. They don't sell freedom, they sell control. For decades, cops, rivals, and even governments have tried to erase them and failed. Because the Mongols aren't just a biker club, they're a shadow army, built to survive anything. And this is what they never wanted you to know.
I think what he's trying to refer to the regiment, it was that program is no longer in place,
Right.
The vetting process to come on board with the Mongols motorcycle.
The Laughlin River Run Massacre. In the early hours of April 27, 2002, one of the most infamous incidents in outlaw motorcycle history erupted inside Harrah's Casino and Hotel in Laughlin, Nevada. The annual Laughlin River Run was meant to be a weekend celebration of motorcycles, gambling, and tourism. That year, it drew more than 50,000 visitors, including two rival clubs whose conflict had been building for decades: the Mongols MC and the Hells Angels MC. Security staff had been warned days earlier that both clubs were en route and should be kept apart, but by 2 a.m., members from each group had entered the casino from opposite sides. Surveillance video later released by investigators shows the exact moment tension broke. Near the main escalator, a Hells Angel kicked a Mongol, setting off a chain reaction that turned a crowded gaming floor into a battleground. In under 90 seconds, fists, knives, and guns came out. Guests hit the floor while slot machines continued ringing above the chaos. When it was over, 3 bikers were dead and 12 injured. The dead were identified as Anthony Barasa, age 45, and Robert Tumilson, age 50, both Hells Angels, and Jeremiah Briggs, age 27, a Mongol. Police recovered more than 70 shell casings, 8 handguns, and multiple knives. Several civilians were struck by stray bullets or hit by flying glass. The Nevada Highway Patrol, Clark County Sheriff's Office, and FBI created a joint task force within hours. Over 100 bikers were detained, 27 motorcycles impounded, and the casino temporarily shut down. Investigators analyzed the surveillance footage frame by frame, mapping each muzzle flash to reconstruct shooter positions. Prosecutors eventually charged 42 individuals with offenses ranging from murder to weapons possession. Court proceedings dragged on for more than 2 years, but witnesses, many of them casino patrons, refused to testify publicly. Without cooperative evidence, most charges were dismissed or reduced. Only a handful of defendants received short sentences for firearm violations. The investigation's lack of closure frustrated law enforcement but elevated the Mongols' reputation within biker circles. They had faced their most powerful enemy head-on, under cameras and casino lights, and walked away largely untouched. In the aftermath, Nevada banned visible biker colors from all major casinos. Federal authorities upgraded the Mongols' classification to a high-risk organized crime group under the Department of Justice's National Gang Intelligence Center. The event also shifted the club's public image worldwide, from a regional California outfit to a national name capable of standing against the Hells Angels in open daylight. The Laughlin Massacre remains one of the few outlaw biker incidents fully captured on security video, used since then in police academies as an example of rapid escalation and crowd chaos. Even 20 years later, documentaries, courtroom exhibits, and training footage keep the night alive, the brief, violent moment when the Mongols' MC announced itself to the world. The killing of Officer Sean Diamond. Hey, investigator family, today we're inviting you to join our inner circle, to become more than just a viewer, to become part of our biker community. For years, we've brought you the cases others won't touch. Now it's time to take that connection to the next level. Introducing our channel membership program. For just $10 a month, join the investigator family. 3 videos every single week. You watch our videos before anyone else. Exclusive early access to all videos. Days before YouTube, 100% ad-free viewing experience. And there are videos that only you can watch. But that's just where it begins. For our most dedicated members, $50 a month, you'll join our private Discord, Group A community of biker enthusiasts just like you, discussing theories, evidence, and perspectives if you won't find anywhere else, and the chance to be featured as our member of the month in a world of sensationalized headlines and surface-level coverage. We've always dug deeper, and now you can go even deeper with us. Join our membership community today. The truth is waiting.
The Mongols motorcycle gang member who admits he shot and killed Pomona SWAT officer Sean Diamond back in 2014. The jury is now deliberating over the fate of David Martinez, who claims it was self-defense when he opened fire with a 12-gauge shotgun while high on meth.
Just after 4 a.m. on October 28, 2014, a multi-agency SWAT team assembled outside a single-story home on San Gabriel Boulevard in San Gabriel, California. Their target was David Martinez, a confirmed member of the Mongols' MC, wanted on weapons-related charges. The team included officers from the Pomona Police Department, FBI, and Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. The operation was routine until the door blew inward and a single shotgun blast came from inside. The shot struck Officer Sean Diamond, age 45, a 16-year law enforcement veteran known for his work in Pomona's gang unit. The round entered below his helmet at the base of the neck. He was rushed to Huntington Memorial Hospital but died the following day after being taken off life support. Martinez surrendered immediately. In statements recorded afterward, he claimed he thought rival gang members were invading his home and insisted he never intended to hit a police officer. Prosecutors, however, argued that Martinez fired knowing a warrant team was outside. They charged him with first-degree murder and special circumstances for killing an on-duty officer. The courtroom battles that followed spanned nearly 8 years. In 2018, the first trial ended in a hung jury after more than a week of deliberations. A second trial in 2021 again failed to secure a murder conviction. Jurors cited confusion over conflicting ballistic evidence, and the defense claimed that Diamond was shot accidentally through a partially opened door. In November 2022, Martinez accepted a plea deal, no contest to voluntary manslaughter and assault with a firearm on a peace officer. He received a 10-year sentence, including time already served since his arrest in 2014. The ruling closed one of California's longest-running biker-related police shooting cases. For law enforcement, Diamond's death underscored how unpredictable Mongols-related operations had become. The Pomona Police Department retired his badge number, 1025, and his funeral drew officers from across the nation. For the Mongols' MC, the incident deepened their status as a symbol of defiance. Even though Martinez's act was framed as a misunderstanding, the killing of a police officer during a Mongols-linked raid strengthened the club's reputation as hostile to authority. In subsequent years, every police briefing before a Mongol search warrant referenced Diamond's case. His name became shorthand for the risks officers face when confronting outlaw motorcycle clubs known to arm themselves heavily and react unpredictably under pressure. The San Gabriel shooting also reignited debate over the line between individual acts and collective identity. Prosecutors pointed to Martinez's membership patch as proof of criminal intent. Defense attorneys argued it was guilt by association. In the end, both sides agreed on one point. The bullet that killed Sean Diamond changed how every agency in California approached the Mongols' MC, from the way warrants were served to how raids were staged. Operation Black Rain.
Operation Black Rain was some undercover agents from the ATF had patched in and joined the Mongols, made full patch member. And for several years they were within the club, witnessing crimes, also instigating crimes. It concluded in 2008. Those were the big raids. Members had been arrested across the country.
In 2008, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives launched one of the most ambitious undercover operations in its history, Operation Black Rain, targeting the Mongols Motorcycle Club. The plan had been in motion for 3 years, led by Special Agent John Ciccone, who had spent decades studying outlaw biker organizations. His team's goal was not just to arrest members, but to dismantle the Mongols from the inside and, if possible, take away their identity itself. The operation began in 2005 when a small group of undercover agents infiltrated the Mongols' Southern California chapters, posing as independent bikers. Over time, they earned trust and full membership, gaining access to club meetings, drug deals, and weapons trades. The agents recorded hundreds of hours of video and audio, capturing everything from methamphetamine distribution to illegal firearm sales. What they found was a structured, disciplined network that extended beyond California into Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, and Oregon. On October 21, 2008, federal teams struck simultaneously in 4 states. More than 600 law enforcement officers took part, arresting 61 Mongols members, including National President Ruben Doc Cavazos. The raid seized large quantities of methamphetamine, cocaine, more than 100 firearms, and dozens of motorcycles. Cavazos was accused of using the club's structure to run narcotics and weapons while profiting personally from the proceeds. But the most unusual part of Operation Black Rain came after the arrests. Federal prosecutors filed to seize the Mongols' trademarked logo, arguing that it represented an instrument of organized crime. The move was unprecedented. If successful, it would make displaying or wearing the Mongols' patch a criminal act. Defense attorneys argued that the government was trying to censor expression under the First Amendment. The case became a landmark battle over the limits of federal power. Cavazos was later expelled from the club, pleaded guilty to racketeering, and served a 14-year prison sentence. However, the government ultimately lost its bid to confiscate the Mongols' logo. In 2019, a federal judge ruled that the club's patch was protected speech, even if members had committed crimes under it. Operation Black Rain crippled the Mongols' leadership but didn't destroy the organization. Within months, new leaders stepped in, chapters reorganized, and the club resumed activity. For the ATF, the operation was a tactical success, but a strategic stalemate the Mongols had survived, even after being infiltrated to their core. The Ontario Bar ambush. Less than a year after Operation Black Rain, violence linked to the Mongols' MC erupted again, this time at a bar in Ontario, California. On the night of February 21, 2009, members of the Mongols clashed with rivals from the Outlaws Motorcycle Club at the Sideshow Bar and Grill, a local biker hangout near Euclid Avenue. What began as a brief argument turned into a deadly ambush that left 2 men shot and several others seriously injured. According to police and witness reports, the Outlaws had been attempting to establish a presence in Southern California, a region long dominated by the Mongols. When members of both clubs appeared at the same venue that night, the atmosphere turned tense. Witnesses said a Mongol member was punched near the bar counter, and within seconds, gunfire broke out. Patrons dropped to the floor as multiple shooters exchanged rounds across the small building. When officers from the Ontario Police Department and San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office arrived, they found 2 men critically wounded and a third dead at the scene. Several motorcycles were riddled with bullet holes, and a handgun was recovered near the bar's entrance. Police detained more than 20 people for questioning, but most refused to cooperate. The investigation revealed that the attack had been premeditated. Detectives found that Outlaws members had been followed earlier that evening, suggesting that the Mongols had anticipated their arrival. Security footage from nearby businesses showed motorcycles circling the block minutes before the shooting began. The San Bernardino County District Attorney's Office later charged 2 Mongols members with murder and attempted murder. Prosecutors described the ambush as part of an escalating turf war that had spread eastward following the power vacuum left by Operation Black Rain. Both defendants pleaded not guilty, and the trials drew large crowds of bikers who filled the courtroom in solidarity. The Ontario bar shooting confirmed what police already suspected, that despite major arrests, the the Mongols were still operating with discipline and precision. They had lost leaders, but not control. For law enforcement, it was another reminder that removing a few members did little to dismantle the network. For the Mongols, the ambush reinforced their image as the enforcers of their own territory, a message delivered in gunfire rather than words. The Fresno County shootout. In April 2014, a string of shootings in Fresno County, California, drew national attention after police linked the violence to the Mongols MC and the Bulldogs street gang. What began as a minor confrontation outside a restaurant on Belmont Avenue grew into days of drive-by gunfire and ambushes across multiple neighborhoods. For local police, it was one of the first times they had seen a traditional motorcycle club and a street gang engage in open warfare on city streets. According to the Fresno Police Department, the violence began when a Mongols member was attacked outside a bar on April 6. Within 24 hours, vehicles tied to known Bulldogs associates were hit by gunfire in retaliation. By April 9, at least 5 separate shootings had been reported, including one outside a family-owned restaurant where several bystanders were injured. Ballistic testing later showed that the same 2 weapons were used at multiple scenes, a .40 caliber handgun and a 9mm pistol, both illegally modified for rapid fire. Chief Jerry Dyer called the situation urban warfare on our streets. The department formed a task force with the California Department of Justice and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives to contain the violence. Officers executed search warrants at several homes tied to Mongols members and recovered methamphetamine, ammunition, and ballistic vests. 6 men were arrested, including Ramon Cruz, a Fresno area Mongol later charged with attempted murder and gang participation. Investigators said the motive was territorial control over local drug routes that ran along Highway 99. The Mongols had long dominated biker trade routes through central California, while the Bulldogs gang controlled the street-level markets. The clash between the two exposed how deeply organized motorcycle clubs and local street gangs had begun to overlap in drug distribution. The Fresno shootings ended after 2 weeks of raids and arrests. More than a dozen suspects were charged, and the city recorded one of its largest multi-agency gang indictments in years. Still, police admitted the violence could reignite at any time. For law enforcement, Fresno was proof that outlaw motorcycle clubs had evolved beyond their old rivalries. For the Mongols MC, it was another public demonstration of their reach and their willingness to fight for control even outside traditional biker territory. The murder of Steve Towson. On October 15, 2011, the long-running tension between the Hells Angels and the Mongols MC resurfaced in San Jose, California, at the funeral of slain Hells Angels member Steve Towson, a killing believed to have originated from Mongols territory. The event turned into one of the most heavily policed biker gatherings in state history. Towson, 52, was a senior member of the Hells Angels San Jose chapter and a former Marine. Earlier that year, he had been shot and killed at a funeral for another Hells Angel. Jeffrey Jethro Pettigrew, the San Jose chapter president, murdered in Sparks, Nevada, during a casino brawl with members of the Mongols MC. Pettigrew's death at the John Ascuaga's Nugget Casino in September 2011 reignited a cycle of revenge. When Towson was later killed at Pettigrew's memorial, authorities suspected that retaliation against Mongol supporters had been in motion. By the time Towson's funeral took place in San Jose, hundreds of law enforcement officers were deployed throughout the city. Helicopters hovered above as police in riot gear surrounded the funeral home. Intelligence reports indicated that Mongols' associates might appear to provoke violence. Although the funeral ended without a major clash, investigators later linked a series of shootings in the Bay Area and Central Valley in the following weeks to revenge acts tied to the Mongols' Hells Angels conflict. The broader feud traced back decades but had been reignited by Pettigrew's killing. In Sparks, a Mongols member named Ernesto Gonzalez was arrested and convicted of second-degree murder for Pettigrew's death. Gonzalez claimed self-defense, but the court rejected that argument and sentenced him to life in prison. Towson's murder in San Jose was seen as a direct consequence of that event, an internal score settling that spilled across state lines. Police used the funerals of Pettigrew and Towson as intelligence-gathering operations, photographing attendees and recording license plates that later formed part of the database used in Operation Black Rain's follow-up investigations. The deaths of Pettigrew and Towson showed how personal rivalries within biker culture often bled into public life, with each killing triggering another. For the Mongols, Nevada became hostile ground. For the Hells Angels, Northern California turned into a fortress under constant surveillance. The funerals, meant for mourning, became reminders that in the world of outlaw clubs, peace was temporary and revenge permanent. the federal patch seizure trial. After decades of criminal investigations, shootouts, and mass arrests, the United States government tried a new strategy against the Mongols Motorcycle Club, one that had never been used against any gang before. In 2018, prosecutors launched a case not to imprison its members, but to strip the organization of its identity itself, its name and logo. The trial stemmed from Operation Black Rain, the massive 2008 ATF operation that led to dozens of convictions. Among the items seized then were Mongols patches, jackets, and the official logo, the image of a caricatured Genghis Khan figure riding a motorcycle. Prosecutors argued that the logo was an instrument of crime, a symbol representing racketeering, drug distribution, and murder conspiracies. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Central District of California, led by Christopher Brunwyn, sought to revoke the Mongols' federal trademark and ban anyone from displaying it. The case was tried before Judge David O. Carter in Santa Ana, California, beginning in December 2018. Over the next year, dozens of witnesses testified about the Mongols' activities. Prosecutors presented thousands of pages of evidence from past operations, murders, drug deals, and assaults, arguing that the patch was used as both intimidation and recruitment. Defense attorney Joseph Yanni, representing the Mongols, countered that the government was overreaching and that punishing a collective symbol violated the First Amendment. He said the government was attempting to criminalize an image rather than an act. The jury found the Mongols guilty of racketeering and conspiracy. But when Judge Carter ruled on sentencing in June 2019, he declined to allow the forfeiture of the logo. In a detailed 40-page ruling, Carter wrote that the U.S. government could not seize collective marks held by an unincorporated association nor suppress symbolic expression. He compared the attempt to a constitutional overstep that could set a dangerous precedent. By 2021, after multiple appeals, the verdict stood. The Mongols could keep their logo. The ruling was celebrated by members across the world as a symbolic victory over federal authority. For the Justice Department, it was a frustrating but historic loss, proof that even with evidence of criminal enterprise, dismantling a group's identity through legal means had limits. The trial's coverage flooded national media and reinforced the Mongols' rebellious image. Their patch, once worn in secret, now appeared in courtroom exhibits, broadcast nationwide, the government's failed attempt to erase an outlaw brand that had become larger than its crimes. The Phoenix Highway shooting on May 25, 2019, a late-night confrontation on Interstate 10 outside Phoenix, Arizona, turned deadly when two bikers, one from the Mongols MC and one from the Hells Angels, exchanged gunfire at highway speeds. The attack, captured partly by nearby traffic cameras, reignited national coverage of the decades-long rivalry between the two clubs. According to the Arizona Department of Public Safety, the incident began around 11:30 p.m., when a convoy of motorcycles traveling westbound near Chandler Boulevard was cut off by another group. Witnesses described a brief chase, followed by muzzle flashes between the lanes. When officers arrived, they found a man later identified as Jesse Wolf Garcia, age 43, a patched member of the Mongols, lying near the shoulder of the road beside his Harley-Davidson. He had been shot multiple times and was pronounced dead at the scene. Detectives recovered bullet casings from two different calibers, confirming that both sides fired. Traffic camera footage showed several riders fleeing the scene immediately after the gunfire. Within hours, the Phoenix Police Department's Gang Enforcement Unit launched a multi-county search. Investigators traced one of the fleeing motorcycles to a Hells Angels member from Mesa, who was later questioned but not charged due to insufficient evidence. The shooting triggered a renewed alert for all law enforcement across Arizona and neighboring states. Officers were ordered to monitor upcoming motorcycle rallies for potential retaliation. In the following weeks, raids in Tucson and Glendale uncovered hidden weapon caches linked to the Mongols, suggesting the club was preparing for possible follow-up attacks. Garcia's death marked the first fatal biker-on-biker highway shooting in Arizona in nearly a decade. For the Mongols MC, it was treated as an act of war. Memorial rides were held across the Southwest, and Mongols members from California and New Mexico gathered in Phoenix for the funeral under police escort. The Australian expansion and Comanchero War. By 2013, the Mongols MC had officially crossed oceans. After years of quiet recruitment and the collapse of several local gangs, the club formally launched in Australia, setting up chapters in Sydney, Melbourne, and the Gold Coast. What followed was a violent turf war with the Comanchero MC, the dominant Australian club that had long controlled the country's motorcycle crime underworld. The conflict began when Mick Harworth, a former Comanchero national sergeant-at-arms, defected to the Mongols, taking dozens of members with him. That defection instantly split Australia's biker scene and set off a chain reaction of attacks. Within months, reports of shootings, arson, and bombings filled Australian news. The first major strike came in October 2013, when Comanchero clubhouses in Brisbane and Sydney's North Ryde were firebombed within hours of each other. No one was killed, but police said the message was unmistakable. The Mongols had arrived. Between 2013 and 2015, police logged over 40 gun incidents, including drive-by shootings, car bombings, and home invasions connected to both clubs. Civilians were repeatedly caught in crossfire. In one case in Broadbeach, Queensland, a Mongols meeting at a restaurant exploded into a street brawl in front of tourists, prompting a massive police crackdown. The Queensland Police Service responded by forming Task Force Maxima, a permanent strike unit targeting outlaw motorcycle gangs. More than 700 officers participated in raids across the country. Over 200 arrests were made, including several Mongols leaders. The government of Queensland introduced harsh anti-bikie laws, making it illegal for more than 2 patched members to gather in public or wear club insignia. Despite those laws, the Mongols survived by decentralizing. They created smaller mobile cells that met privately and avoided traditional clubhouses. Investigators later found encrypted chat logs showing coordination between Australian chapters and Mongols members in Southern California, proving direct international command. By 2015, the Comanchero War had burned itself out under relentless police pressure, but the Mongols had succeeded in establishing a permanent Australian foothold. Law enforcement called it the largest foreign motorcycle club expansion in Australian history. For the Mongols MC, it marked their evolution from an American gang into a global syndicate, capable of transplanting their code, culture, and conflicts onto any continent. The assassination of Mahmoud Ahmad.
Police say crime kingpin Mahmoud Brownie Ahmad was warned that he had a $1 million bounty on his head before he was shot and killed in Sydney's south.
On the night of April 27, 2020, the long war between Sydney's criminal networks reached a breaking point when Mahmoud Brownie Ahmad, a well-known enforcer with ties to the Mongols MC, was gunned down outside a home in Greenacre, a suburb of Western Sydney. His death triggered weeks of police raids and public fear that an all-out gang war was about to begin. Ahmad, 41, was a major player in Sydney's organised crime scene. Police described him as a standover man who collected debts and enforced contracts for several biker and Middle Eastern crime groups, including the Mongols. He had survived multiple assassination attempts before, including a public shooting in 2016 that left him wounded but alive. At around 9 p.m, Ahmad arrived at a friend's house on Narelle Crescent. As he stepped from his car, multiple gunmen opened fire with high-powered rifles. Neighbors reported hearing more than a dozen shots. Ahmad died at the scene before paramedics arrived. Witnesses saw 2 vehicles speed away, a stolen Maserati SUV and a Toyota Camry, both later found torched in nearby suburbs, a method typical of Sydney's underworld executions. Detectives from the New South Wales Homicide Squad and Task Force Erebus were assigned to the case. They linked Ahmad's death to ongoing conflicts between Mongols members and rival Middle Eastern crime families over cocaine imports through Sydney's port. Within weeks, police raided several Mongols clubhouses in Fairfield and Liverpool, seizing weapons, cash, and vehicles. Authorities believe Ahmad was killed in retaliation for orchestrating the 2019 murder of Rami Iskandar, a relative of the slain underworld figure Bilal Hamzi, who also had Mongols connections. His assassination was widely viewed as the start of a chain of revenge killings that rocked Sydney through 2020 and 2021. More than 3 years later, no one has been convicted for the murder. Australian investigators have linked the suspects to overseas networks in Turkey and Dubai, underscoring how globalized the Mongols' operations had become. Ahmad's death exposed the dark overlap between outlaw motorcycle clubs and Sydney's international crime economy. For the Mongols MC, it was a reminder that power came with visibility, and visibility made you a target. The Riverside Tattoo Shop firebombing. In 2010, a small tattoo shop in Riverside County, California, became the target of a violent attack that investigators later linked to members of the Mongols Motorcycle Club. What began as a business dispute turned into a firebombing that destroyed the store and exposed how far the Mongols would go to maintain control and silence defiance within their territory. The victim, a tattoo artist known locally as Jose J. Meza, operated the shop near Mission Boulevard in Jurupa Valley. According to police reports, Meza had refused to pay a protection fee demanded by individuals associated with the Mongols. Within weeks of that confrontation, he began receiving threats. On the night of July 15th, just after midnight, 2 men were captured on nearby surveillance cameras, approaching the shop on motorcycles. One carried a gas can and a rag. Seconds later, an explosion ripped through the front windows, engulfing the interior in flames. Firefighters arrived within minutes, but the building was already beyond saving. The blaze spread to an adjacent barber shop before it was contained. No one was injured, but losses were estimated at over $100,000. Investigators with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department and ATF quickly classified the fire as arson. Chemical analysis confirmed the use of gasoline and a homemade ignition device. Within days, detectives identified 2 suspects, Ramon "Ghost" Romero and Daniel Torres, both known Mongols associates from the Inland Empire chapter. Search warrants executed at their homes uncovered club paraphernalia, ammunition, and communication devices matching those seen on surveillance footage. Both men were arrested and charged with arson, conspiracy, and gang enhancement under California's anti-criminal organization statutes. Prosecutors described the attack as a textbook example of intimidation through fear. During court proceedings, testimony revealed that local shop owners often paid taxes to avoid similar retaliation. The defense argued that the firebombing was a personal dispute unrelated to the Mongols' organization, but investigators testified that club insignia was visible on the suspects' jackets during the attack. In 2012, Romero and Torres were convicted and sentenced to 20 and 15 years in prison, respectively. For law enforcement, the case became one of the most concrete examples of the Mongols' territorial enforcement methods outside of open warfare. The Riverside firebombing demonstrated how the Mongols' influence extended beyond biker rivalries into civilian life. It wasn't about competition with other clubs, it was about control. One burned building sent a message stronger than any threat ever could. Return to Laughlin River Run clash. 2 decades after the 2002 Laughlin River Run massacre, history nearly repeated itself. During the 2022 Laughlin River Run, what was supposed to be a peaceful motorcycle festival again erupted into violence when members of the Hells Angels and Mongols MC clashed at Harrah's Casino and on the nearby streets of Laughlin, Nevada. On April 23, 2022, around 11:30 a.m., a 911 call reported gunfire near South Casino Drive. Police and emergency services responded to scenes spread across several locations, including parking lots and nearby hotels. At least 6 people were shot, with 1 confirmed dead and 5 injured. Eyewitness videos later uploaded to social media showed men wearing Mongols and Hells Angels patches exchanging gunfire behind a row of parked motorcycles. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, which holds jurisdiction over Clark County, immediately established a task force alongside the Nevada Highway Patrol and FBI. Investigators described the confrontation as an organized escalation, not a random brawl. The slain victim was identified as Jeffrey Jethro Pettigrew Jr., the son of former San Jose Hells Angels president Jeffrey Pettigrew, who had been killed by a Mongols member in Sparks, Nevada, 11 years earlier. The connection fueled speculation that the shooting was a revenge act by the Angels. Officers detained 8 suspects, including several Mongols members from California and Arizona. Police recovered multiple handguns, shell casings, and 2 motorcycles believed to have been used during the escape. Surveillance video from the Laughlin River Lodge captured fragments of the incident, but not enough to identify who fired first. Clark County Sheriff Joseph Lombardo described the clash as a tragic echo of 20 years ago. Casinos in the area were temporarily locked down, and the remainder of the River Run Festival was cancelled. The return of violence to Laughlin reminded both the public and law enforcement that the old rivalries between the Mongols and Hells Angels were far from finished. Despite decades of investigations, undercover operations, and trials, the 2 clubs remained locked in the same territorial conflict that first made headlines in 2002. For the Mongols, the 2022 incident carried symbolic weight. Returning to Laughlin, where one of their earliest defining moments occurred, signaled both resilience and defiance. For authorities, it was proof that time had changed little about the culture of outlaw brotherhoods. Every generation seemed destined to repeat the same cycle of pride, vengeance, and bloodshed. Global crackdowns. As the Mongols' MC expanded beyond North America, law enforcement agencies across Europe began to view the club as an international organized crime syndicate. The first major European confrontation occurred in Germany during the early 2010s, when the Mongols attempted to establish new chapters in Berlin, Cologne, and North Rhine-Westphalia. Local authorities, already struggling with violence involving the Hells Angels and Bandidos, responded aggressively. In June 2011, coordinated SWAT raids swept through more than a dozen properties across western Germany. Police seized firearms, narcotics, cash and computers, and detained over 50 people suspected of Mongols membership. The raids followed a series of public brawls and shootings, including a violent confrontation in Cologne that left 3 hospitalized. The German Federal Criminal Police Office, BKA, labeled the Mongols a high-threat organized structure, placing them on par with mafia-level operations. Authorities in Bavaria and North Rhine-Westphalia soon issued regional bans on the Mongols patch, making it illegal to display or wear the club's insignia in public. The bans were later upheld by German courts. Despite that, splinter groups continued operating under alternate names, often without wearing patches, to avoid prosecution. Around the same time, the Mongols moved into Spain, establishing chapters in Madrid and Andalusia. Spanish police linked these chapters to weapons trafficking, money laundering, and cocaine imports routed from North Africa. In 2014, a major joint operation between Europol and the Spanish National Police led to the arrest of 17 Mongols members and the seizure of automatic weapons, over €100,000 in cash, and several high-end vehicles. The European Commission later cited the Mongols MC in a 2015 report on transnational organized crime, highlighting how American biker clubs were merging with local gangs to control ports and trafficking routes. Despite arrests, police admitted that the Mongols' cell-like structure made it nearly impossible to eradicate entirely. Each country's crackdown merely pushed activity underground or across borders. By the end of the 2010s, the Mongols had become a recognized threat on Interpol's list of international outlaw organizations. Their resilience showed that dismantling chapters through raids and bans could slow expansion but not end it. The meth ring busts in 2008, just months before Operation Black Rain culminated in mass arrests. Federal agents uncovered a sprawling methamphetamine network run by members and associates of the Mongols Motorcycle Club. The discovery exposed the financial engine that had quietly fueled the Mongols' expansion for years, an interstate drug system stretching from Southern California through Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. The investigation began when DEA agents traced chemical shipments of pseudoephedrine, a key meth ingredient, to a warehouse near Riverside, California. Surveillance revealed a steady stream of visitors, many wearing Mongols' colors, arriving at irregular hours and hauling boxes to and from trucks. Over several weeks, agents documented multiple transactions consistent with bulk drug production. In April 2008, the DEA, FBI, and ATF jointly raided the Riverside facility and several rural superlabs scattered across the desert east of Barstow. The coordinated sweep seized over 200 pounds of methamphetamine, more than $1 million in cash, and dozens of firearms, including fully automatic rifles and sawed-off shotguns. 43 suspects were arrested, 12 of whom were confirmed Mongols members. Prosecutors said the labs operated like industrial factories. Chemical storage rooms were equipped with ventilation systems, timers, and temperature sensors, signs of long-term production. Investigators also discovered money ledgers and coded notebooks listing payment routes, quantities, and initials of distributors. According to court documents, part of the profit was funneled into legal defense funds for incarcerated Mongols and the opening of new chapters across state lines. Among those indicted were Anthony Rooster Velasquez, a regional Mongols leader in Riverside, and Carlos Duarte, identified as the main logistics coordinator. Both later pleaded guilty to federal narcotics distribution and received sentences of 20 and 25 years. For law enforcement, the meth busts proved that the Mongols MC had evolved beyond being a violent street club. It was a financially structured criminal enterprise. The evidence showed a clear hierarchy, supply chain, and reinvestment strategy similar to organized cartels. Even after the arrests, DEA agents noted that splinter labs reappeared months later, often using different members and unmarked warehouses. The Mongols' adaptability frustrated investigators, who called it a franchise model of crime. The Riverside meth case became a foundation for the later Operation Black Rain indictments, linking drug profits to weapons trafficking and racketeering. For the Mongols, it was a reminder that their most lucrative business also carried the heaviest exposure. One raid could cost millions, but dismantling an empire that spanned states would take more than a single operation. The Fresno County Meth Network. By 2016, the Mongols' MC's involvement in narcotics had shifted from production to coordination. The new structure relied on distribution hubs managed by local associates who moved drugs on behalf of regional Mongols chapters. One of the clearest examples of this modernized model came from Fresno County, California, where a meth trafficking network was dismantled after a multi-year federal investigation. The operation, led by the U.S., Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of California began in 2014 when police intercepted communications between Mongols members and street-level dealers in Fresno and Tulare counties. The network distributed meth supplied by sources in Southern California and Mexico. Surveillance showed regular meetings at warehouses, auto body shops, and bars controlled by the Mongols. In July 2016, DEA, ATF, and Homeland Security investigations agents executed coordinated raids under Operation Red Reaper. More than 20 defendants were indicted on federal drug charges, including James "Tank" Kota, a Fresno area Mongols member accused of overseeing shipments of meth worth millions. Agents seized over 50 pounds of methamphetamine, 20 firearms, and $200,000 in cash. The indictment revealed that the network operated as a layered hierarchy. Suppliers in Southern California shipped bulk meth to mid-level distributors in Fresno, who then resold it to local gangs for street-level sales. The Mongols' role, according to prosecutors, was logistical control, providing transportation, protection, and intimidation for anyone moving drugs through their territory. Court filings showed that the group used encrypted messaging apps and burner cell phones to coordinate deliveries, and vehicles were often equipped with hidden compartments for drugs and cash. Investigators also uncovered financial transfers routed through auto dealerships and motorcycle parts, stores used as laundering fronts. In 2018, Kota and 6 others pleaded guilty to conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine. He received a 30-year sentence, one of the harshest ever given to a Mongols member in a drug case. The operation disrupted the Mongols' Northern California supply chain, but did not end it entirely. Federal officials later stated that smaller cells quickly replaced the Fresno group, continuing the flow through other counties. The Fresno meth case illustrated how the Mongols had shifted from visible violence to economic crime, a quieter, more profitable form of power. For the club, it was business as usual. Where one network collapsed, another quietly emerged, proving that the Mongols' reach extended far beyond what could be measured in arrests. The Pacoima Street Shootout. On October 21, 2005, the streets of Pacoima, a working-class neighborhood in Los Angeles' San Fernando Valley, turned into a gun battle zone. What began as a late-night confrontation between the Mongols' motorcycle club and a rival gang ended with 2 dead, several injured, and a neighborhood shaken by more than 50 rounds of gunfire. According to the Los Angeles Police Department's Foothill Division, officers were called to Glen Oaks Boulevard shortly after 11 p.m. following reports of automatic gunfire. When they arrived, they found 2 men dead beside overturned motorcycles, both later confirmed to be Mongols members. Shell casings littered the street, and multiple parked cars had been riddled with bullets. Witnesses said a convoy of motorcycles had been followed by a dark SUV and a sedan before gunfire erupted. Detectives soon learned that the vehicles belonged to members of the Avenues Gang, a local street gang that had recently clashed. Police later identified Miguel "Lil Joker" Herrera, an Avenues enforcer, as the suspected ringleader. The ATF joined the investigation after ballistics analysis revealed that 2 of the recovered weapons were previously linked to a federal firearms case in Arizona, an early sign of how deeply biker networks and street gangs had become intertwined. Over the next few weeks, raids were conducted across Los Angeles and San Bernardino counties. Multiple suspects were arrested, including Herrera, who was charged with double homicide and weapons. It marked the beginning of new gang task forces designed to investigate biker street alliances that would later reappear across California's criminal landscape. The Pasadena Bar Brawl. By 2007, tensions between the Mongols MC and the Hells Angels had grown increasingly violent across Southern California. That tension reached a flashpoint on August 24th, when a fight broke out at the Crazy Horse Saloon in Pasadena, one of the city's busiest late-night bars. The Pasadena Police Department later described the incident as a planned confrontation that turned chaotic. Around 10:30 p.m., several Mongols members entered the bar, while Hells Angels supporters were already inside. Surveillance video showed the groups exchanging words before one man threw a punch. Within seconds, fists, bottles, and chairs were flying. The crowd of nearly 200 patrons rushed for the exits as the fight spilled into the parking lot. Witnesses recalled hearing what sounded like fireworks, but investigators later confirmed that at least 7 shots were fired. 2 men, 1 Mongol and 1 Hells Angels associate, were taken to Huntington Memorial Hospital with gunshot wounds. Several others were treated for head injuries from blunt objects. Officers from Pasadena, Altadena, and San Gabriel police departments flooded the scene within minutes. 4 people were arrested, including Richard "Bullet" Morales, a known Mongols member previously linked to an assault in Pomona. Police recovered 2 handguns and a knife from the scene. detectives learned that the brawl was part of a wider dispute dating back to the 2002 Laughlin River Run massacre. Both clubs had been banned from most major venues since that event, but individual members often ignored the restrictions. The Crazy Horse Saloon, which did not enforce a dress code, became neutral ground until that night. In the months following, Pasadena police increased patrols at biker events and coordinated with the ATF to track attendees of both clubs. The bar was temporarily closed under city order, citing safety violations. While no one was killed, the fight reignited fears of a broader turf war in Los Angeles County. The Pasadena Brawl was another headline that reinforced their reputation for public aggression, a defining trait that kept them feared as much by civilians as by rivals. For law enforcement, it was a reminder that outlaw motorcycle violence didn't need a highway or casino to erupt. It could happen in a crowded bar on an ordinary night. Sparks' casino killing of Jethro Pettigrew. At the height of Nevada's annual Street Vibrations Motorcycle Festival, the polished floors of John Ascuaga's Nugget Casino in Sparks became a war zone. On September 23, 2011, hundreds of bikers crowded the casino when an argument between Hells Angels and Mongols MC members exploded into gunfire. Security footage later revealed the confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. At its center stood Jethro Pettigrew, the 51-year-old president of the San Jose Hells Angels, and Ernesto Manuel Gonzalez, a 53-year-old Mongols member from California. Witnesses said a punch was thrown first. Gonzalez drew a handgun and fired 4 times. Pettigrew was hit in the back and head, collapsing between slot machines as terrified gamblers fled under tables. Police arrived within minutes, locking down the casino and every nearby hotel. The shooting left Pettigrew dead and 2 bystanders wounded. Gonzalez fled on his motorcycle but was arrested 2 days later after a statewide manhunt. Prosecutors charged him with second-degree murder and firearms enhancements. During his 2013 trial in Reno, prosecutors presented casino surveillance showing Gonzalez raising his arm and firing as Hells Angels rushed him. The defense argued self-defense, claiming Pettigrew had beaten Gonzalez moments earlier with brass knuckles. The jury rejected that claim, convicting Gonzalez and sentencing him to life in prison with parole eligibility after 10 years. The murder ignited a chain of revenge killings. Just 3 weeks later, Hells Angels Sergeant-at-Arms Steve Towson was shot dead at Pettigrew's memorial in San Jose by another member during a dispute over retaliation plans. Those 2 linked deaths reignited a decade-old feud between the Angels and Mongols, pulling law enforcement into renewed surveillance of both clubs across the West Coast. The Sparks casino killing was a chilling reminder that biker violence could erupt anywhere, even under chandeliers. For the Mongols, it became part of their identity, proof they would confront the Angels anywhere, even in public daylight and under 1,000 security cameras. Berlin SWAT raids on Mongols MC. In the early hours of June 23, 2011, more than 600 German police officers surrounded 20 properties across Berlin, Cologne, and North Rhine-Westphalia. Their targets: suspected Mongols, MC clubhouses, and safe houses, believed to be storing weapons for an upcoming clash with the Hells Angels. At 5 a.m., simultaneous raids began. Explosions from breaching charges echoed through apartment blocks as armored vehicles rolled into narrow Berlin streets. Inside the properties, officers found submachine guns, pistols, explosives, and cash bundled in Mongols-branded leather. 55 people were detained, most of them confirmed Mongols members or associates. The raids followed months of escalating incidents between the Mongols and rival clubs. In Cologne, a street brawl involving nearly 100 bikers had left 3 men hospitalized. Police wiretaps later revealed Mongols leaders in Germany were importing firearms through contacts in Eastern Europe. Authorities feared a full-scale biker war, similar to the Scandinavian conflicts of the 1990s. After the raids, Germany's Federal Criminal Police Office, BKA, petitioned the Interior Ministry to ban the Mongols' insignia entirely. Within weeks, regional governments in Bavaria and North Rhine-Westphalia enacted laws prohibiting display of the Mongols' patch or logo. It was the first time a US-born motorcycle club had its identity outlawed in Germany. Investigators said the raids uncovered evidence of drug trafficking, illegal arms deals, and connections to organized crime groups from the Balkans. One seized laptop contained encrypted ledgers linking German Mongols to members in California, proving the organization's direct international control. While most detainees were released within days, several were charged with weapons possession and racketeering. German officials declared the operation a success, saying it disrupted a planned violent summit between the Mongols and Hells Angels in Berlin that summer. The crackdown forced the Mongols to dissolve their German chapters temporarily but intelligence later confirmed they regrouped under the front name Brotherhood Motorcycle Club. Even under new colors, investigators said the hierarchy and members remained identical. The June 2011 raids marked the beginning of continental coordination against outlaw bikers for Europe's law enforcement. For the Mongols, it marked their arrival as a global name, feared well beyond America's highways. Victorville weapons bust. On December 5, 2010, San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputies raided a storage facility in Victorville, California, uncovering one of the largest illegal weapons caches ever tied to the Mongols Motorcycle Club. The bust ended a 6-month investigation that traced firearms trafficking from the Inland Empire to Arizona and Nevada. Detectives began following the trail after a traffic stop in Apple Valley, where a driver linked to the Mongols was caught with 5 unregistered handguns. Ballistic testing connected 2 of them to a drive-by shooting in Hesperia earlier that year. Surveillance led investigators to a row of storage units rented under fake names but paid in cash. When deputies executed a search warrant, they found more than 70 firearms, including AR-15 rifles, sawed-off shotguns, and illegal machine gun conversions, along with thousands of rounds of ammunition and body armor. Several of the weapons still bore serial numbers, matching burglary reports from across Southern California. 4 men were arrested at the scene: Luis Trigger Valdez, Anthony Reyes, Carlos Delgado, and Victor Montes, all confirmed members or associates of the Mongols High Desert Chapter. Prosecutors said the group had been running guns to street gangs in Los Angeles in exchange for methamphetamine and cash. Federal ATF agents joined the case, classifying it as part of a larger firearms smuggling network. Court documents revealed the operation had been using motorcycle repair shops as fronts to modify and sell weapons illegally. One ledger found inside the unit listed over 200 transactions, totaling more than $1 million in profit over 2 years. During sentencing in 2012, Valdez received 25 years for weapons trafficking and possession of a machine gun. Reyes and Delgado each received 15. The case became a cornerstone example for California's Gun Violence Task Force, which used it to justify tighter firearms tracking laws statewide. For the Mongols, the Victorville bust was an expensive embarrassment. Dozens of chapters relied on weapon sales to maintain income after federal crackdowns on drug profits. Losing a major Inland Empire depot exposed how fragile their infrastructure had become under constant surveillance. It was a victory for the police, measured not only in seized rifles, but in proof that the Mongols' reach extended into conventional arms, smuggling a trade usually dominated by cartels. It also showed that beneath the image of chrome and leather was a modern criminal network, moving military-grade weaponry across state lines. From backroom bar fights to global police raids, the Mongols' MC have left a trail written in bullets, ink, and blood. What began in East Los Angeles as a brotherhood of outcasts grew into one of the world's most feared motorcycle clubs, an organization the law still struggles to contain. Each decade brought new enemies, new wars, and new headlines, but the message remained the same: power is taken, never given. Even after arrests, bans, and internal losses, the patch still rides. To their followers, it's loyalty. To their rivals, a warning. And to law enforcement, a reminder that empires don't always rise from money or politics. Some are built on asphalt, defiance, and the promise of never backing down. It began with a courthouse escape that stunned the nation, then unraveled into one of the biggest outlaw takedowns in American history. Behind the roar of motorcycles and brotherhood oaths hid a $1 million empire built on meth, money, and fear. The bandidos weren't just riding the highways, they were running them. But when the walls finally closed in, one man slipped through them, turning justice into legend. What really happened inside the empire, that law couldn't cage. Birth of an empire, from San Leon to a global brand of fear. The bandidos did not begin as a multinational criminal enterprise. They began in 1966 in San Leon, Texas, founded by a dock worker named Donald Eugene Chambers. What grew from a handful of Houston area riders became a global network with more than 2,500 members in 303 chapters, spanning 22 countries by 2014. The club's public face fused rebellion and brotherhood, patched together by the fat Mexican insignia and an outlaw creed. We are the 1% who choose our own rules. By the 2000s, that mythology was matched by a hard legal reality. Federal and state agencies classified major outlaw motorcycle clubs as organized crime groups tied to drug trafficking, weapons movement, money laundering, and intimidation. The US Department of Justice and the FBI assessed the broader outlaw ecosystem as a $1 billion criminal marketplace. Inside that marketplace, Colorado mattered. The Bandidos' Denver West Side chapter matured into a distribution hub with reach beyond state lines, its reputation an asset and a shield. The transcript's focus is precise, a three-man core directing $1 million pipeline. At the top was Philip Lee Duran, about 42 at the time, known in the club as Bandido Fay or Fee, serving as National Sergeant-at-Arms. In the outlaw hierarchy, that post enforces discipline, interprets rules, and projects authority. Investigators say he also coordinated multi-state drug activity. Working at his shoulder was Michael Derek Menson, 46, nicknamed Bandido Tick, also described as National Sergeant-at-Arms and a coordinator for distribution and logistics. On the ground in Colorado, Lorenzo Luis Sojo, 41, served as president of the Denver West Side chapter, the operational epicenter for receiving methamphetamine, managing mid-level dealers, and pushing product through the metro area. What separated this enterprise from street corner dealing was design. Supply linked back to wholesale sources in California capable of delivering multi-pound quantities of high-quality meth. Colorado functioned as a relay and retail command post. Firearms moved as a parallel revenue stream, sourced where purchase was easier and shipped where profit was higher, including routes to Las Vegas. Money did not hide under mattresses. It flowed through banks and transfers, layered to reduce detection, then parked in businesses to appear legitimate. The insignia drew fear. The structure moved the inventory. The financial tactics made crime look like commerce. By late 2014, outward signals were sent on the inner machine. Authorities noticed high-ranking members living far beyond plausible wages, custom bikes, luxury cars, expensive routines, while the Denver West Side chapter's reputation hardened as a regional nerve center. To test the suspicion, agencies designed a multi-layer response. They needed to hear orders, see shipments, and touch money. They needed to map a business, so began the operation whose codename mirrored its quarry. Operation Tick and Flea Collar, building a case like a business plan. The investigation opened in September 2014 under the Colorado Attorney General's office with the Metro Gang Task Force and quickly expanded to federal partners, the DEA, FBI, and ATF. The target set was not a chapter to be harassed, but a structure to be proven. Agents layered traditional surveillance with modern intrusion, wiretaps, electronic intercepts, and undercover work to penetrate the club's closed circuit of trust. What surfaced matched the logic of an enterprise chart. California wholesaler relationships stood upstream, with orders coordinated under the authority of National Sergeant-at-Arms status. That status mattered because authority reduced friction. When a buyer's rank carries the weight of club enforcement, reliability increases, and suppliers become confident that money arrives on time and debts are collected themselves. The product traveled to Colorado. There, Sojo's chapter rationed bulk into weight for mid-level associates who understood the consequences of theft and the value of recurring business. Menson's role meshed supply and sales, coordinating shipments, smoothing disputes, and ensuring timelines were met. Weapons trafficking evolved as a second line of revenue, notable not only for profit but for risk. Assault-style rifles, handguns, and explosives entered the same logistical lattice that moved meth. The brand power of the patch became a layer of operational security. Rivals hesitated, witnesses went quiet, and the aura of violent consequence kept the pipeline efficient. What wiretaps added was certainty. Conversations captured pricing by weight and quality for California meth. They recorded logistics around loaded firearm shipments to Las Vegas. They preserved discussions of cleaning cash through businesses and moving funds across state lines with the help of complicit professionals. Just as importantly, they documented the role of violence and intimidation. In this economy, force was not a hobby, it was a business tool. Debtors faced harm, rivals were pushed out by beatings or worse. Even officers faced attempts at pressure when enforcement threatened operations. Investigators also traced external connections to other criminal organizations, including cartel sources and international money channels. That breadth justified a strategy shift. Rather than take early arrests on drug counts, the team pursued a comprehensive case under Colorado's Organized Crime Control Act, a state-level counterpart to a RICO-style theory. The goal was not a public splash, it was a structural dismantling. On January 28, 2015, the Attorney General's team and federal partners executed coordinated raids across the Denver area. The design of the takedown balanced safety with seizure value. The bandidos were known to be armed. The plan reduced opportunities for confrontation while maximizing evidence capture. At Duran's residence, agents seized bank records, transfers, communications with financial facilitators, weapons, and drug equipment. At Menson's home, they found shipping records for firearms, communications with California suppliers, and financial documentation that illuminated profit tracking and cost control. At Sojo's address, agents secured distribution artifacts, customer lists, drug tools, and communications with mid-level dealers in the metro zone. Across the sites and related locations, officers seized roughly 2.5 pounds of methamphetamine, with an estimated street value of about $40,000, and assets totaling about $175,000 in cash, vehicles, and property tied to drug proceeds. The wiretaps when the walls began to speak. By early 2015, Operation Tick and Flea Collar had reached its turning point. What began as a quiet observation had evolved into a full-scale, multi-agency operation. And now, investigators finally had what they needed to strike: the voices of the empire itself. The bandidos prided themselves on secrecy, on a code that bound brothers to silence, but technology would prove stronger than loyalty. For months, wiretaps, microphones, and surveillance devices turned their own network against them. The bandidos' inner circle didn't know it yet, but their walls had begun to speak. The decision to go for wiretaps wasn't taken lightly. Getting judicial approval to record high-ranking members of a national outlaw motorcycle club required solid groundwork. Prosecutors had to prove to a judge that traditional surveillance had reached its limits, that only direct interception could reveal the truth. When the orders were signed, agents moved quickly, disguising equipment, tracing phones, and setting up listening stations that would capture the secret conversations of some of the most dangerous men in Colorado's criminal underworld. The first recordings were slow. The men at the top spoke in half sentences, switching slang and avoiding direct terms. They talked about packages instead of methamphetamine, rides instead of shipments, tools instead of guns. But patterns began to emerge, and analysts started matching code words to real events. Each call became a piece of a puzzle, filling in the gaps of a criminal enterprise that had operated in the shadows for years. Then came the breakthrough. One wiretap captured a call between Philip Duran, the National Sergeant-at-Arms, known as Bandido Fee, and a contact in California. The conversation was mundane at first, small talk, laughter, but then shifted to business. Duran asked for 4 of the good kind double-bagged and confirmed the delivery run through the hill. Investigators cross-referenced the timing of the call with surveillance data and found that a vehicle had left Los Angeles carrying exactly 4 pounds of high-purity methamphetamine. The connection was now undeniable. A week later, another recording caught Michael Derek Menson, Bandido Tick, discussing the sale of firearms to a buyer in Las Vegas. He described tools with no paperwork, long ones, and clean handles. Agents later matched the details to real transactions involving semi-automatic rifles, handguns, and illegal modifications. The bandidos weren't just moving drugs, they were fueling the black market with weapons that could resurface anywhere from gang disputes to cartel wars. In a separate conversation, Lorenzo Sojo, president of the Denver West Side chapter, was overheard advising an associate on how to clean the lines. Investigators later learned lines referred to money transfers, smaller deposits structured across multiple bank accounts to avoid suspicion. The conversation exposed a web of accounts, fake invoices, and legitimate-looking business fronts that disguised the movement of drug money. It was no longer speculation. The bandidos had built an underground economy inside the legitimate one. As more wiretaps came in, agents began piecing together the structure of the operation. They realized that what looked like chaos from the outside was a tightly controlled business model. Duran handled supply and oversaw protection. Menson managed logistics and enforcement. Sojo maintained local distribution and ensured loyalty among dealers. Beneath them operated a layer of mid-level distributors, men and women who never wore patches but played critical roles. These associates moved product, laundered money, and stayed just far enough from the center to think they were safe. One of the most revealing conversations didn't come from the leaders at all, but from a lower-level member complaining about debts. His call mentioned Tick and Fee as if they were bosses of a company, not a club. He referred to percent cuts and monthly tallies. Those few minutes of frustration confirmed what prosecutors later argued in court, that the bandidos had transformed their outlaw club into a profit-driven criminal organization. The recordings also exposed the fear that governed the network. Members spoke carefully, their words lined with tension. Some talked about missing money, others about lessons being taught to unreliable dealers. One call described a rival who tried to sell meth in bandido territory. Days later, that rival was found beaten and hospitalized. The messages were clear. The bandidos didn't just run a business, they enforced it through calculated violence. With every intercepted conversation, the walls closed tighter. Federal agents could now predict meetings before they happened, intercept shipments before they arrived, and identify safe houses before the club realized they'd been compromised. The task force began recording not just voices but movements. Surveillance cameras captured exchanges, car switches, and coded handovers. Each new piece of evidence built towards something larger, a complete picture of the Empire's daily operations. But the wiretaps also revealed something more human: paranoia. As the months went on, the tone of the conversations shifted. Duran's voice, once confident and commanding, grew cautious. He talked about rats, about new faces watching. Menson began moving meetings, switching phones, and questioning everyone's loyalty. Even Sojo's calls sounded clipped, as if he sensed the net tightening. The arrogance that had defined the club's leadership was fading, replaced by an undercurrent of fear they couldn't name but clearly felt. By late 2014, investigators had amassed hours of recordings, each one a thread in a web of corruption, greed, and control. The transcripts ran hundreds of pages long. Combined with surveillance logs, banking records, and physical seizures, they painted a story too detailed to deny. When prosecutors reviewed the material, they saw not an outlaw gang, but a functioning business, complete with leadership, supply chain, revenue streams, and internal discipline. The wiretaps had done what informants and infiltration couldn't. They turned the Bandido's own communication system into evidence. The takedown, when the doors broke open. January 28, 2015. Before sunrise, Denver was still wrapped in quiet cold. But across the city, more than 100 officers from the DEA, FBI, ATF, and local task forces were already in motion. Unmarked SUVs rolled into position, radios whispered final confirmations, and tactical teams tightened their vests. Operation Tick and Flea Collar had been 2 years in the making, and this was the moment it all led to. The strike that would bring down the Bandidos' leadership in Colorado. The plan was precise. Each target's location had been tracked for weeks. Philip Duran's home, the nerve center of the operation, was marked as primary. Michael Menson's residence, filled with ledgers and logistics, came next. And then there was Lorenzo Sojo, the president of the Denver Westside chapter, the man who kept the distribution network alive. All three were to be taken simultaneously to avoid warning the others. The operation began at 5 a.m. sharp. When the first door went down, the silence of Denver's dawn shattered. Agents stormed into Duran's residence, announcing their presence before he could react. Inside, they found the trappings of wealth that had drawn suspicion in the first place: luxury motorcycles, designer watches, and electronics. But what mattered more were the papers scattered across his desk: bank statements, money transfer receipts, coded ledgers, and notes linking shipments between Colorado and California. In a locked room, investigators uncovered drug packaging materials, scales, and a small but telling stash of methamphetamine. Across the city, similar scenes played out. At Menson's house, agents uncovered a treasure trove of logistics: shipping receipts, burner phones, notebooks, and maps showing routes through Nevada and Utah. One room contained tools for modifying firearms, suggesting he was coordinating the weapon trafficking side of the business. At Sojo's home, agents found customer lists, communications with mid-level dealers, and a garage rigged for product processing, a makeshift drug lab hidden behind what looked like a motorcycle workshop. The raids were swift and coordinated. Within hours, all three men were in custody, along with several associates identified during the investigation. The seized evidence confirmed everything the wiretaps had suggested. Over 2.5 pounds of methamphetamine were recovered, valued at roughly $40,000. Alongside the drugs came $175,000 in cash and assets, vehicles, jewelry, and accounts tied to laundering. It was the tangible proof of a $1 million operation running under the guise of brotherhood. 8 individuals in total were indicted under the Colorado Organized Crime Control Act. This wasn't a simple drug case. It was organized crime, and prosecutors intended to treat it as such. The charges included narcotics trafficking, weapons distribution, money laundering, and conspiracy. The law had finally caught up with a network that had built its reputation on being untouchable. For law enforcement, the success was more than symbolic. It showed that with patience and precision, even the most secretive criminal organizations could be dismantled. The Bandidos had survived raids before, but this one hit harder because it wasn't just about drugs. It was about structure. The takedown targeted leadership, communication, and finance all at once, leaving no one to fill the void. Inside the courtroom, the tone shifted quickly from defiance to negotiation. Faced with undeniable evidence, recorded conversations, financial documents, and eyewitness accounts, each of the 3 leaders eventually pleaded guilty. Menson received 24 years, Sojo 20, both historic sentences for members of an outlaw motorcycle club. But the trial that drew the most attention was still to come. Philip Duran, the man known as Bandido Fee, was the highest-ranking member arrested, and the one law enforcement feared most. His reach extended beyond Colorado, and his reputation as a ruthless enforcer made him a symbol of the Bandido's power. His sentencing was expected to be the final nail in the coffin of the Denver operation. The Great Escape, the day Philip Duran vanished. October 28, 2016. The Denver District Court was crowded, but the tension was quiet, the kind of silence that comes before a verdict. After nearly 2 years of investigation and months of legal proceedings, the case of State of Colorado versus Philip Lee Duran was nearing its end. Duran, known within the Bandidos as Bandido Fee, sat at the defense table wearing a court-ordered ankle monitor. He was facing decades in prison. His fate seemed sealed. Yet within hours, he would become something entirely different, a fugitive, a legend, and a symbol of the Bandidos' enduring defiance. The morning began uneventfully. Duran entered the courthouse wearing civilian clothes, calm as ever. Prosecutors outlined his crimes, his leadership role, his coordination of drug and weapons trafficking, his laundering network that stretched across state lines. They painted him as the architect of a criminal empire disguised as a motorcycle club. To them, this was justice finally catching up to a man who had outrun it for too long. His defense argued the opposite, that he was a loyal club member caught in a net cast too wide, a man who'd already lost everything. The court broke for a brief recess around midday. The room emptied, conversations echoed down marble corridors, and Duran stood. No one noticed when he left through the side hallway. He walked out of the courthouse doors into the bright Colorado afternoon, calm and unhurried, as though he were stepping out for air. Minutes later, security realized he hadn't returned. By the time anyone checked, his ankle monitor was already found on the pavement, sliced clean through. The National Sergeant-at-Arms of the Bandidos Motorcycle Club had just vanished from under the state's nose. The escape was stunning in its simplicity. There was no gunfire, no getaway car roaring through alleys, just a quiet walk into freedom. For a man known for orchestrating large-scale criminal operations, it was almost poetic. Within hours, local and federal agencies mobilized. The U.S. Marshals, FBI, and Denver police coordinated a manhunt stretching across state lines. Airports, bus terminals, and border crossings were alerted. Duran was officially classified as armed, dangerous, and unpredictable. But Duran wasn't just any fugitive. He was a man who had spent his life navigating the underworld, hiding in plain sight, making connections in every city he touched. Law enforcement knew his reach extended far beyond Colorado. There were whispers that safe houses existed across Texas, Nevada, and Arizona, and that allies within other motorcycle chapters might help him disappear. For the Bandidos, his escape was more than an embarrassment to law enforcement. It was a declaration. One of their highest-ranking officers had slipped through the system, and that made him a hero among outlaws. Despite a nationwide alert and a $2,000 reward for information, no one came forward. Rumors spread that Duran had fled to Mexico or was hiding in rural Texas under a false name. Some believed he had died in hiding, others insisted he still lived quietly within a biker community, protected by loyalty stronger than fear. No verified sighting ever confirmed his whereabouts. For investigators who had worked years to dismantle his operation, Duran's escape felt like unfinished business, a reminder that justice, even when close, can slip away. For the outlaw world, however, his disappearance became myth. Bandidos members spoke of him in hushed tones, as if his escape had restored their pride after the club's humiliation in Colorado. His act symbolized rebellion in its purest form, a man walking away from the system that sought to cage him. The aftermath of Duran's disappearance forced agencies to reassess procedures for high-risk defendants. It exposed how even the most methodical investigation could falter at the finish line. For years afterward, his name remained on wanted lists, but no trail ever solidified. It was as though the man had stepped out of one world and dissolved into another. Operation Tick and Flea Collar had brought down the Bandidos' empire in Colorado, but Duran's escape left one last scar, proof that power, once earned in that world, doesn't vanish easily. He had turned sentencing day into legend. And while the courts closed his file, his story never ended. Somewhere out there, the man who outsmarted the system had become what every outlaw dreams of, untouchable. The legal aftermath, breaking the backbone of the Bandidos. When the dust settled after the Denver takedown, the headlines painted it as one of the most significant blows ever delivered to the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. Years of investigation, hundreds of pages of transcripts, and carefully planned raids had reduced $1 million criminal operation to evidence boxes and court filings. Yet inside the courtroom, the tone was not triumphal. What followed was quieter, slower, and in some ways more destructive. The systematic dismantling of the Bandidos' legal and financial structure piece by piece. The first sign of change came with the indictments. Instead of filing simple drug charges, prosecutors used the Colorado Organized Crime Control Act, a state-level mirror of the federal RICO statute. It allowed them to treat the Bandidos not as a handful of independent criminals, but as a single criminal enterprise. Every member who had helped the network, whether by handling cash, storing drugs, or maintaining vehicles, was linked under one case. This approach reframed the entire investigation. It wasn't about meth or guns anymore. It was about leadership, hierarchy, and accountability. In early hearings, prosecutors laid out a story that shocked even those familiar with outlaw motorcycle clubs. They described a structure resembling a corporation, with clear divisions of labor and control. Philip Duran functioned as executive management, connecting suppliers and enforcing discipline across states. Michael Menson was the logistics officer, handling shipments, payments, and schedules. Lorenzo Sojo, as chapter president, acted like a regional manager, ensuring distribution efficiency and local compliance. Beneath them were branch operators, mid-level dealers who earned commissions and faced punishment if profits fell short. The courtroom audience learned that the Bandidos weren't trading in chaos, but in consistency. Ledgers were neat, records were coded thoroughly. They even held meetings that mirrored board reviews, only their discussions centered on shipments instead of sales projections. What law enforcement had discovered wasn't a gang. It was an underground company built on loyalty and intimidation. Defense attorneys tried to argue that the prosecution was overstating the case. They claimed the financial records were circumstantial and that their clients were being punished for cultural association rather than proven acts. But the recordings, photos, and surveillance told a different story. The wiretaps alone captured hours of negotiation and coordination, while bank documents showed deposits timed within minutes of drug deliveries. The evidence closed every loophole before the defense could widen it. When sentencing began, the atmosphere in court was heavy. For law enforcement, these moments were the reward for 2 years of invisible work. For the Bandidos, it was the reckoning that none of them had believed would arrive. Michael Derek Menson, Bandido Tick, was sentenced first. He stood silently as the judge read 24 years of imprisonment. The court cited his national position and the scale of his logistics network as aggravating factors. When the sentence was announced, his only visible reaction was a small nod. He had spent decades enforcing silence. He wasn't going to break it now. Lorenzo Luis Sojo, president of the Denver West Side chapter, received 20 years. Prosecutors argued that he had overseen local distribution and maintained the pipeline that supplied Denver's streets. Evidence from his garage, including drug-cutting equipment and coded contact lists, confirmed his operational control. His sentence effectively ended the West Side chapter's reign in Colorado, stripping the club of one of its most profitable territories. For the community around them, the case was a revelation. Neighbors who once saw the Bandidos as loud but harmless bikers learned they had lived beside a drug empire. Local businesses that had unknowingly laundered small sums of money through club-connected accounts found themselves investigated, their reputations in question. The fallout spread beyond the club. It reached bartenders, mechanics, and small-town shop owners who had dealt with the group out of friendship or fear. The one case that never concluded was that of Philip Duran. When he escaped during his sentencing recess, he transformed from defendant to legend, leaving behind an empty chair and an ankle monitor. His disappearance overshadowed the courtroom victories, reminding everyone that even the best-planned operation can't catch every thread. To prosecutors, his flight was infuriating. To investigators, it was unfinished work. Yet even without his sentencing, his empire was gone. Financially, the Bandidos' Colorado network collapsed almost overnight. With leadership imprisoned and assets frozen, their operations disintegrated. Accounts were seized, properties confiscated, and legitimate-looking businesses shut down under forfeiture orders. The $175,000 recovered during the raids was only a fraction of their total revenue, but the seizure crippled their cash flow. Without leadership or capital, the organization's influence in Colorado vanished within months. The sentences sent shockwaves through other outlaw motorcycle clubs. The use of organized crime statutes meant the government could pursue leadership, not just foot soldiers. It set a precedent. If a club operated like a business, the law would treat it like one. This changed how other chapters across the country managed their dealings. Meetings grew smaller, cash movements became harder to trace, and paranoia spread among members who feared wiretaps. For law enforcement, the operation validated years of cooperation between agencies. The DEA, FBI, ATF, and Colorado Attorney General's office had worked together seamlessly, combining resources and intelligence. It became a blueprint for future multi-agency operations targeting organized crime disguised as culture. Publicly, the bandidos maintained their defiance. Spokespersons insisted the arrests were exaggerated, that the men sentenced were individuals, not representatives of the Brotherhood. But internally, the blow was catastrophic. Losing 2 high-ranking sergeants-at-arms and a chapter president gutted their chain of command. The Denver West Side Patch, the club's local insignia, went dormant. What had once been a symbol of fear became a relic of a lost era. Aftermath and manhunt. The hunt for Duran. In the weeks following Philip Duran's escape, Denver's skyline looked the same, calm, unshaken. But beneath that stillness, an unprecedented manhunt was underway. Law enforcement had captured 2 of the bandidos' most powerful figures, dismantled their financial infrastructure, and crippled their drug routes. Yet the one man they most wanted was gone. The national sergeant-at-arms of the Bandidos Motorcycle Club had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a cut ankle monitor and 100 unanswered questions. The Denver District Court had never seen anything like it. A defendant under maximum supervision simply walked away in the middle of the day. No disguises, no accomplices, no alarms. For the U.S. Marshals Service, it was an embarrassment that demanded correction. Within 24 hours of his disappearance, Duran was officially listed as a fugitive from justice, and his name was transmitted to every law enforcement database in the country. Teams began canvassing Denver's outskirts, searching motels, rest stops, and trucking depots along Interstate 70 and I-25, the same highways Duran's operation had once used to move meth and guns across state lines. Investigators quickly realized they weren't hunting an amateur. Duran had built an empire on logistics, and his knowledge of the landscape gave him an advantage few fugitives possessed. He understood how to disappear, which backroads avoided cameras, which bars wouldn't ask questions, and which brothers could offer a couch or a burner phone without leaving a trace. The Bandidos' network stretched from Texas to the Pacific coast, and that gave him options. Agents believed he had at least 3 potential escape routes: south toward Mexico, west toward Nevada, or east into the plains, where loyalty and silence were as reliable as any border wall. Leads poured in, but went nowhere. Sightings from Amarillo to Albuquerque, each one just far enough apart to be believable. One report claimed a man matching Duran's description was seen riding a Harley near El Paso, wearing no club colors, but carrying the unmistakable swagger of a veteran biker. Another tip suggested he'd crossed into northern Mexico under a false name, protected by cartel allies who once supplied his meth pipeline. None of it was confirmed, and for every rumor that surfaced, another led investigators back to dead air. Behind the scenes, federal agents traced phone numbers tied to former Bandidos associates, hoping to catch a call that might reveal his location. They subpoenaed bank records, watched post office boxes, and monitored known safe houses. Still, Duran remained invisible. Even his family, who were placed under protective questioning, claimed to have no contact. It was as if he had planned the escape for months, preparing every contingency while pretending to cooperate with the courts. As the weeks turned into months, the case shifted from active chase to long pursuit. The U.S. Marshals raised the reward to encourage tips, though few dared to speak. In the world Duran came from, silence was survival. Bandidos members who might have known something understood that talking meant exile or worse. The outlaw code, loyalty above all, worked in his favor. It shielded him better than any alias ever could. The press turned his flight into myth. Local news stations replayed courtroom footage, analyzing his calm demeanor and speculating about how he pulled it off. National outlets branded him the man who walked away, a living symbol of the outlaw mystique that had always fascinated the American public. To law enforcement, it was infuriating. To the underground biker community, it was legendary. Duran had outplayed the system at its own game, vanishing without a gunshot or chase, just sheer nerve and timing. Months later, a sealed report circulated within the task force suggesting Duran had been spotted in Mexico's northern corridor near Chihuahua. Agents couldn't confirm it, but they noted a pattern. Whenever surveillance focused on one region, word spread through biker channels, and Duran seemed to fade just ahead of the dragnet. It was the same strategic intuition that once kept his operation alive: reading movement, anticipating risk, and always staying one turn ahead. By mid-2017, the manhunt lost its urgency, but never ended. Duran's wanted poster stayed active, circulated to every border crossing and international field office. Interpol was notified, though extradition would be complicated if he had truly crossed south. Within the Bandidos organization, whispers claimed he was still patched in, living under a different name but respected as a symbol of unbroken will. Law enforcement, however, saw his disappearance differently. To them, it wasn't defiance, it was unfinished business. Operation Tick and Flea Collar had dismantled the structure, but Duran's escape meant that a piece of the network's knowledge, its financial systems, contacts, and supply lines, still existed somewhere out there, perhaps dormant, perhaps waiting. His capture would have been closure. Without it, the case remained a half-drawn circle. Over time, his story blurred the line between criminal history and folklore. He became a cautionary tale at law enforcement seminars, a reminder that even airtight cases can spring leaks when confidence replaces caution. For the outlaw world, he was the proof that rebellion could still outwit order, a man who refused to let a courtroom decide his ending. Operation Legacy: How the Case Changed Organized Crime Policing. Operation Tick and Flea Collar didn't just dismantle a criminal network, it reshaped how law enforcement understood and fought organized crime in America. Before this case, outlaw motorcycle clubs were often viewed as loud, rebellious nuisances, a mix of bar fights, backroom deals, and small-town intimidation. After Denver, that illusion was gone. The Bandidos weren't a band of misfits anymore. They were a blueprint for how modern crime hides in plain sight. For years, the Bandidos had managed to balance their outlaw image with structured business practices. They ran chapters like franchises, complete with hierarchy, revenue streams, and recruitment systems. This hybrid model, half street gang, half corporation, allowed them to grow quietly while appearing chaotic to outsiders. Operation Tick and Flea Collar was the first investigation to break that illusion by treating the club as what it truly was: a criminal enterprise with management, accounting, and international reach. The Colorado Organized Crime Control Act had existed for years, but the Bandidos case made it practical. Instead of charging individuals for isolated crimes, prosecutors built a collective narrative that showed how every action, every deposit, every shipment, every phone call was part of one coherent system. This enterprise model of prosecution became the gold standard for future cases involving gangs, cartels, and criminal syndicates. It taught investigators that if you follow the money, you can follow the power. The impact was immediate. Agencies that had once operated in silos, local police, DEA, FBI, ATF, began sharing data with unprecedented transparency. The success of Operation Tick and Flea Collar proved that no single agency could fight organized crime alone. Colorado's multi-agency task force became a model for future collaborations across the country. By integrating resources and intelligence, investigators could map criminal operations more effectively than ever before. Financial forensics emerged as the most powerful weapon in that fight. Traditionally, biker gangs were targeted through drug busts and weapons seizures. But this operation proved that bank ledgers and transfer records could do more damage than any raid. The Bandidos' downfall wasn't triggered by an informant or a violent encounter. It came from spreadsheets, wire receipts, and the digital footprints of greed. The realization that crime could be prosecuted through accounting forever changed investigative priorities. Technology also took center stage. The case marked one of the first major uses of advanced electronic surveillance on an outlaw motorcycle club. The wiretaps, encrypted communication tracing, and cross-state data mapping set precedents for future investigations. After Denver, biker gangs across the US began abandoning phones, switching to encrypted apps, and minimizing digital contact, all signs that Operation Tick and Flea Collar had struck at their confidence. Law enforcement adapted just as quickly, investing in cyber divisions and analytics teams designed to chase crime through technology rather than the streets. But the operation's legacy wasn't just technical, it was psychological. For decades, outlaw motorcycle clubs thrived on a myth. That brotherhood and silence made them untouchable. When the Colorado leaders were brought down not by betrayal, but by professionalism, that myth fractured. Members realized that loyalty couldn't stop data, and brotherhood couldn't hide money trails. Clubs across the nation became paranoid. Meetings grew shorter, membership requirements tightened. What was once a proud culture of visibility retreated into secrecy. Internally, law enforcement began to redefine how it viewed these organizations. Instead of chasing individual crimes, agents started studying group behavior, analyzing the sociology of clubs and how they evolved. They recognized that the Bandidos' structure was both their greatest strength and their eventual weakness. Hierarchy made them efficient, but it also made them predictable. When you could map the flow of command, you could dismantle it from the top down. Operation Tick and Flea Collar also shifted public perception. The romanticized image of the motorcycle outlaw, the leather-clad rebel who stood against the system, started to fade. The public saw what law enforcement had always known. Behind the image were ledgers, laundering, and drugs that destroyed communities. Local news outlets ran features on how the methamphetamine epidemic in Colorado is tied directly to biker operations. The myth was no longer glamorous, it was industrialized crime. For prosecutors, the case became a teaching tool. Law schools and justice programs studied it as an example of coordinated prosecution, financial investigation, and controlled enforcement. The use of enterprise law, where leadership faces equal punishment for crimes committed under their command, became a blueprint for cases against cartels and extremist groups alike. The ripple effects even reached politics. Federal funding for gang task forces increased. States expanded their organized crime statutes. The idea of network dismantling replaced the outdated concept of kingpin targeting. The goal was no longer just to arrest leaders, it was to erase infrastructure so the organization couldn't rebuild. Yet the most important legacy of the operation may have been cultural. For every biker who saw Duran's escape as defiance, others saw his empire's collapse as inevitability. The outlaw world began to reckon with its changing reality. Technology, surveillance, and financial transparency have made the old codes harder to live by. The open-road freedom that once defined the lifestyle was now fenced in by modern policing. Years later, retired agents who worked on Operation Tick and Flea Collar described it as a turning point. Not because of the arrests, but because it changed how they thought about control. The case proved that organized crime evolves like a living organism, adapting to pressure, finding new routes to survive. But it also showed that law enforcement, when unified, could evolve faster. The Bandidos still exist, but the Denver chapter's fall remains a cautionary story within the club itself. It taught them that arrogance is louder than any engine, and that the road between power and ruin is shorter than it looks. For law enforcement, it was the opposite lesson, that patience, coordination, and quiet work can break empires that guns alone never could. The evolution of the Bandidos, rebuilding or retreating. After the fall of their Colorado leadership, the Bandidos Motorcycle Club stood at a crossroads that few outlaw organizations ever face. Their empire had been publicly dismantled, their operations exposed, and their reputation fractured. Yet, true to their nature, the Bandidos did not vanish. They adapted. Like a wounded animal learning to move differently, the club began to evolve, shifting its structure, tactics, and presence to survive in a world that had learned how to hunt them. At first, the blow from Operation Tick and Flea Collar was paralyzing. Chapters across the United States were forced into silence. National meetings, once loud, defiant displays of unity, grew smaller, quieter, and more secretive. Where hundreds of bikes once roared through highways in full colors, only a few appeared at a time, careful and discreet. The club had learned that visibility meant vulnerability. Denver had been a wake-up call. Law enforcement no longer underestimated them, and the price of arrogance was prison. In Texas, where the club was founded, leadership shifted. The loss of senior figures like Duran and Menson created a vacuum, and into that space stepped a younger, more calculating generation. These men were less romantic about the old outlaw image. They didn't boast about open wars or barroom brawls. They understood surveillance, digital tracking, and how law enforcement now thought. They rebuilt the organization in fragments, smaller, more decentralized cells that operated independently but pledged loyalty to the larger brotherhood. This structure reduced exposure. If one chapter fell, the others could still function. Internationally, the Bandidos retained their reach. Their chapters in Europe and Australia remained powerful, though even there, the ripples from Colorado were felt. German and Scandinavian police increased monitoring of their local branches, often citing the Denver case as proof that the club's global operations were connected by money, not just culture. In some countries, governments began treating the Bandidos as transnational criminal organizations, putting them under laws typically reserved for cartels and terrorist groups. Inside the United States, the Bandidos' American leadership adopted what members called the silent patch policy. It was an internal rule encouraging discretion over dominance. Patches were still worn, but appearances at public events were limited. The club's online presence was scrubbed, and communication moved to encrypted platforms. The brotherhood that once thrived on intimidation now survived on invisibility. They traded spectacle for strategy. Financially, the loss of the Colorado pipeline was devastating. Without the Denver West Side chapter's infrastructure, the Bandidos lost one of their most profitable narcotics corridors. But true to their business instincts, they pivoted. Reports in later years suggested that smaller local chapters began diversifying, moving from meth distribution into smaller-scale, less detectable ventures like counterfeit goods, credit fraud, and underground gambling. These crimes were less dramatic, but they carried lighter sentences and drew less attention. The Bandidos were learning the art of staying alive by staying quiet. Yet, for all the changes, the club never abandoned its culture of loyalty. Inside biker circles, the Bandidos' colors still carried weight, perhaps even more after Denver. Members spoke of the Colorado chapter as martyrs of modern outlawry, men who stood tall until the system caught them. And of course, the legend of Philip Duran lingered like a shadow over every meeting. His escape became myth, a story told in garages and backroads bars, a reminder that even in defeat, defiance could still find a way. Law enforcement, meanwhile, continued watching. After the takedown, task forces across the country began monitoring other Bandidos chapters for signs of resurgence. But the new structure made it harder. The decentralization worked. Each chapter kept its operations limited, using coded language, rotating leadership, and avoiding electronic records whenever possible. If the old Bandidos had been a corporate empire, the new version was a scattered network of independent contractors bound by tradition, not hierarchy. It was harder to catch, harder to prove, and infinitely more cautious. Despite the transformation, violence still lingered beneath the surface. The Bandidos' long rivalry with the Hells Angels flared sporadically, especially in the southern states, where control over highways and distribution routes remained a point of pride. Shootouts and confrontations became rarer but deadlier, surgical strikes instead of wars. Each act of violence served as both message and myth-making, reinforcing the idea that, while quieter, the Bandidos were far from extinct. The cultural side of the club also evolved. Younger recruits were different. They weren't drawn by the old promise of brotherhood against the world. They were drawn by legacy. For them, wearing the patch wasn't about rebellion. It was about belonging to something ancient and feared. Many of these recruits grew up hearing stories of Duran's escape, of Menson's trial, of the empire that once stretched from Denver to the Pacific. They saw themselves not as criminals, but as inheritors of a legend that had survived the government's best attempt to erase it. Still, not all change was internal. Some former members broke away completely, disillusioned by the risks. They saw the writing on the wall. Law enforcement would never stop watching. Many left the club quietly, starting families or small businesses, but even in retirement, the stigma followed. In the outlaw world, leaving wasn't freedom. It was exile. Once a bandido, always marked. As for the public, fascination never faded. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials revisited the Denver case as both warning and myth. Every few years, journalists would ask the same question: what happened to Philip Duran? And every time, the silence deepened the story. Some swore he was dead. Others believed he still moved among the shadows, guiding the next generation from afar. Legacy of the Empire: Lessons from the Rise and Fall. The story of Operation Tick and Flea Collar ends where all great criminal empires eventually arrive, not with glory, but with reflection. By the time the Colorado courts closed their files and the last appeals were denied, the Bandidos' empire in the American West was gone. What remained was something more powerful than money or motorcycles. A legacy that forced both law enforcement and the outlaw world to see themselves differently. The empire had fallen, but its lessons remained carved into the history of organized crime. For the Bandidos, the Colorado takedown became a symbol of both pride and humiliation. Within the club's mythology, it was remembered as a story of betrayal by the system. A brotherhood crushed not by force, but by paperwork, wiretaps, and patience. Yet beneath that pride lingered fear. The case proved that the state could learn their language, infiltrate their operations, and anticipate their moves. The romantic notion of being untouchable vanished. The Bandidos had lived for decades on the edge of society, believing the law could only react to them. After Denver, they knew the law could outthink them. Among older members, there was bitterness. They had seen their leaders paraded in handcuffs, their colors splashed across the evening news. What once was a symbol of rebellion had become evidence of criminality. For the younger generation, though, the story became legend. They grew up hearing about Philip Duran, the man who walked out of court and disappeared, the outlaw who refused to kneel. His escape turned him into folklore, proof that defiance still had a place in a world ruled by surveillance and control. Whether he lived or died didn't matter anymore. In the outlaw imagination, he would always ride free. But for law enforcement, the legacy was practical, not mythical. Operation Tick and Flea Collar changed the way they built cases. It showed that the path to dismantling organized crime wasn't through confrontation, it was through comprehension. Agents learned that the key to breaking criminal organizations was understanding their structure, their culture, and their economics. They stopped chasing bikers on highways and started chasing numbers in bank ledgers. Crime had become administrative, and so had justice. The operation also reshaped inter-agency cooperation. Before it, state and federal agencies often guarded information like territory, each protecting its own cases and methods. But the success of Operation Tick and Flea Collar came from unity, a joint task force that ignored bureaucratic boundaries. The FBI's intelligence, the DEA's narcotics expertise, the ATF's firearm tracing, and the state's legal reach combined into one coordinated force. That model spread across the country. From biker clubs in Texas to cartel cells in Arizona, similar task forces were formed using the same blueprint. Its influence reached further still, into training manuals, policy reforms, and even university criminology courses. The operation became a case study in modern organized crime. Professors cited it as proof that traditional hierarchies, whether corporate or criminal, are both their strength and their weakness. A structured system allows efficiency, but it also leaves a map. And once that map is drawn, dismantling the empire becomes a matter of time. The fall of the Bandidos Colorado branch also changed public perception. For decades, movies and media have glorified motorcycle clubs as symbols of freedom, rebellion, and anti-establishment spirit. After the raids, that image darkened. The public saw the truth. Beneath the leather and chrome lay corruption, exploitation, and addiction. Methamphetamine wasn't rebellion, it was poison. The brotherhood wasn't loyalty, it was hierarchy enforced through fear. The cultural divide between biker romanticism and biker reality became impossible to ignore. And yet, even in failure, the Bandidos' story holds a strange power. It's a reminder of how charisma, loyalty, and myth can turn a small group of men into a global phenomenon. The same traits that made them dangerous also made them enduring. Their organization, for all its brutality, was a reflection of something deeply human: the desire to belong, to rebel, and to live outside control. That's why they keep reappearing in new forms and new cities long after their empires crumble. For law enforcement, the operation offered a valuable lesson in humility. Success didn't mean victory forever. Every time an organization like the Bandidos adapts, investigators must evolve again. The battle between order and outlaw is cyclical. Neither side ever truly wins. The Bandidos learn to hide better. The police learn to see deeper. What remains constant is the chase itself, repeating generation after generation, reshaped by technology but fueled by the same human instincts. In the years since, Operation Tick and Flea Collar has stood as a line in the sand. It was the moment when myth met method, when an empire built on fear faced an opponent that understood it completely. The raids in Denver didn't just break a network, they exposed a transformation of crime, of justice, and of identity. Today, the Bandidos still exist. Their chapters meet in quiet corners of Texas, Europe, and Australia. Their motorcycles still ride, though less boldly, their colors warm beneath jackets instead of over them. They are smaller, older, more cautious, but still breathing. And somewhere, in the silence between engines, the story of Denver still echoes. It's told as both a warning and an inspiration, depending on who's listening.